There is a symbol that has haunted the imagination of the modern world for nearly a century. Two bones crossed beneath a hollow-eyed skull. You have seen it on uniforms, on gravestones, on the flags of armies long since turned to dust. It is one of the oldest military emblems in human history, worn by Prussian cavalry, painted onto aircraft, stitched into the black wool of men who believed themselves to be the guardians of a new order. But for one particular formation of the Second World War, that skull was not merely a symbol. It was a statement of intent, a philosophy sewn into fabric and pressed against the skin of men who would spend 12 years proving exactly how far a human being could drift from the recognizable boundaries of conscience. This is the story of the SS Totenkopf Division. And before we go any further, take a moment, find a comfortable position, let your shoulders drop, breathe. What follows over the course of this documentary is long, and deliberately so, because this story cannot be told in fragments. It demands the full weight of its own length. It demands that you sit with the discomfort of understanding how something this dark was built, piece by piece, with patience and purpose, by men who believed they were doing something necessary. So settle in. And if this is your first time here, consider staying, because this channel exists for exactly this kind of deep, unhurried telling of history. Now, back to that skull. In the late 1920s, Germany was a country in the process of consuming itself. The democratic experiment of the Weimar Republic was buckling under the pressure of economic catastrophe, political extremism, and a deep cultural wound that had never properly healed after the armistice of 1918. Into that wound, various factions poured their poisons. Among them was a relatively small but rapidly growing paramilitary movement, the Schutzstaffel, the SS, which had begun as a personal bodyguard for Adolf Hitler and would eventually become one of the most powerful and criminal organizations in human history. The death's head insignia arrived within this movement, almost organically, borrowed from older German military traditions, stripped of their original context, and pressed into the service of something entirely new. By the early 1930s, as the National Socialist German Workers' Party consolidated power with terrifying speed, that skull had found a permanent home, and the man who would give it its most lasting and terrible meaning was a former First World War officer named Theodor Eicke. Eicke was not, on the surface, a particularly remarkable figure. He was difficult, volatile, prone to insubordination, and had spent time in psychiatric detention before being handed the command of the Dachau concentration camp in 1933. What he did with that command would define the trajectory of the entire war on the Eastern Front a full decade later. At Dachau, Eicke did not simply run a prison. He built a system, a set of rules, rituals, hierarchies, and punishments so total and so deliberate that they fundamentally reshaped the men who enforced them. He created guards who did not question. He created enforcers who understood cruelty, not as an aberration, but as a professional obligation. And he called these men his Totenkopfverbände, his death's head units. This is where the division truly begins. Not on a battlefield in France, or a frozen plain outside Leningrad. It begins in the watchtowers of Dachau, in the parade grounds of a concentration camp, where young German men learn to see their charges not as human beings, but as enemies of the state who had forfeited any claim to dignity. That lesson, that the enemy is not fully human, that restraint is weakness, that absolute obedience to the mission overrides every other consideration, did not stay within the wire of the camps. It came with those men when they picked up rifles and marched into Poland in the autumn of 1939. It came with them into France, It came with them into the Soviet Union, and it shaped the way they fought and the way they killed, across 6 years and thousands of kilometers. What makes the Totenkopf Division such a difficult subject is precisely this duality, because alongside all of that, alongside the documented atrocities, the massacres, the crimes that would be examined in courtrooms after the war, there is also a military history of genuine ferocity and tactical capability. By the time of the great armored battles of 1942 and 1943, the Totenkopf had been forged by the Eastern Front into something its original camp guard structure could never have anticipated. It had taken losses that would have destroyed many conventional divisions. It had been encircled, exhausted, starved, frozen, and reduced to a fraction of its authorized strength on multiple occasions. And it had, against all reasonable expectation, continued to function. That resilience, as grim and morally compromised as its origins were, is part of the historical record, and it demands honest examination. That is what this documentary is built to do. Over the course of 18 chapters, we will follow this formation from its first conceptual breath in the concentration camp system of the early 1930s, all the way to its final dissolution in the chaos of May 1945. We will meet the commanders who shaped it, trace the campaigns that defined it, and sit with the evidence of what it actually did, not to sanitize, not to glorify, but to understand. Because understanding how a military unit of this kind is built and sustained is not an act of celebration. It is an act of vigilance. It is the work of people who believe that history examined honestly is the only history worth having. There will be moments in this telling that are difficult to hold. There will be chapters where the military narrative and the criminal record run so closely alongside each other that they cannot be meaningfully separated, because they could not be meaningfully separated in reality either. The Totenkopf was not a normal division that occasionally did terrible things. Its criminality was structural. It was trained in, indoctrinated in, tolerated, and in some cases, actively encouraged from the very top of its chain of command. That is the historical conclusion, and this documentary will not flinch from it. But it will also not reduce these men to cardboard monsters, because that reduction does its own kind of damage to our understanding. The most unsettling truth about the Totenkopf, about any of the SS formations of the Second World War, is not that the men who served in them were incomprehensibly different from other human beings. It is that they were not. They were shaped by systems, by language, by hierarchy, by the slow normalization of things that should never have been normalized. That process, that drift, is worth understanding, because it did not begin and end with one German division in one war. So here we are, the beginning of a very long journey through one of the most studied, most debated, and still most misunderstood formations of the Second World War. If you are here for sleep, then let this narration carry you. Let the history flow around you in the dark. And if you are here to learn, truly learn, without shortcuts, then this documentary was made for you. Subscribe if this kind of storytelling is what you come here for. Share it with someone who takes history seriously, and then settle back in, because we are going to start at the very beginning, with a skull, with a man named Ike, with a concentration camp in Bavaria, and with the first, quiet, terrible steps toward one of the most consequential military formations the modern world has ever seen. The story of the SS Totenkopf Division starts now. The skull had been watching over soldiers for centuries. Long before the Nazi regime pressed it into service, the Death's Head, that stark white skull set against absolute black, had decorated the helmets of Prussian hussars, the collar patches of Imperial shock troops, the armbands of veterans too proud or too angry to simply go home after the Great War ended. It was a symbol that said something specific and deliberate, that the man wearing it had made a particular peace with death, or perhaps had decided to become its instrument. When the fractured, humiliated Germany of the 1920s began producing its crop of paramilitary organizations, the skull came with it, passing from one armed formation to another, like an inheritance no one had legally claimed. Right-wing veterans groups wore it. Freikorps units adopted it. Street fighting formations stitched it onto their caps and told themselves it gave them something ancient and unconquerable. By the time the National Socialist movement began its long, ugly climb toward power, the death's head had already accumulated decades of violent meaning, and the men who would build the SS understood exactly what they were borrowing. The Schutzstaffel, the protection squadron, began its existence as a personal bodyguard unit, small and subordinate, kept in deliberate check by the larger and more boisterous Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts whose street violence was the more visible face of Nazi intimidation. But Heinrich Himmler, who assumed command of the SS in 1929, saw something different in what he had inherited. He did not see a bodyguard. He saw the skeleton of an entirely new kind of institution, one built not on the loud, populist brutality of the brown shirts, but on something colder and more methodical. Himmler began his reconstruction quietly, systematically, selecting men not just for their willingness to commit violence, but for their ideological reliability and their capacity for absolute obedience. The death's head insignia, formalized as the SS Totenkopf, became central to this project. It was not decoration. It was a declaration of the SS's claim to stand apart from ordinary men and ordinary moral frameworks, to inhabit a different category of existence entirely. By the time Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January of 1933, the SS had grown from a few hundred men into a substantial organization with ambitions that far outpaced its official role. The political crisis that followed the Reichstag fire in February of that year gave the regime the emergency powers it needed to begin dismantling the structures of Republican Germany. And within weeks, political opponents, communists, socialists, union organizers, journalists, anyone who had publicly opposed the movement, were being arrested in enormous numbers. The existing prison system could not hold them all. The regime needed somewhere to put people that was outside the normal legal framework, somewhere that answered to a different authority. The answer came quickly. Dachau, a small town in Bavaria, not far from Munich, had a disused munitions factory on its outskirts. On the 22nd of March 1933, it opened as Germany's first concentration camp. Into this new institution came Theodor Eicke. He was not, at first glance, an obvious candidate for the role he would eventually occupy. His early life had been marked by instability, professional failure, and a kind of consuming rage at a world he felt had persistently undervalued him. He had served in the Great War, worked as a police informant afterward, lost civilian jobs, and drifted between occupations with a restless, embittered energy. He had joined the Nazi movement early and embraced it with the completeness of a man who had found in ideology the explanation for all his disappointments. By the early 1930s, he was causing serious internal problems within the SS itself, arrested at one point on charges related to political violence and explosives possession, briefly interned in a psychiatric institution. It was Himmler who rescued him, Himmler who saw in Eicke's volatility and ferocity not a liability to be managed, but a quality to be deployed. In June of 1933, Himmler appointed Eicke Commandant of Dachau. What Eicke did at Dachau over the following months was methodical in a way that his biography had not suggested he was capable of. He did not simply run a detention facility. He designed a system. Within weeks of his appointment, he had produced a set of disciplinary regulations for the camp that reduced every interaction between guard and prisoner to a codified procedure, specifying exactly which offenses warranted which punishments, eliminating any possibility of individual judgment or mercy. The document was precise, and it was total. It removed from the guards any personal responsibility for what they did to prisoners, by converting brutality into bureaucratic process. A guard who beat a prisoner was not acting on personal cruelty. He was executing a regulation. Iker understood instinctively that this transformation was essential, that men would do far worse things to other human beings if they believed they were following orders than they ever would if they had to own the act themselves. The guard formations Iker built at Dachau were called the Death's Head Units, Totenkopf, and the name was worn with a particular pride. Iker selected and cultivated men whose worldview matched his own, men who had absorbed the movement's racial ideology deeply enough that the prisoners in their care had ceased to be fully human in any meaningful sense. This was not an accident. The dehumanization was intentional and systematic, reinforced through daily rhetoric, through the language used to describe prisoners, through the rituals of domination built into every hour of the camp day. Iker held regular political instruction sessions for his guards, in which the ideological framework for their work was explained and repeated until it was automatic. The enemies of Germany were not merely political opponents. They were biological threats, racial contaminants, subhuman elements that Germany needed to be protected from. The men of the Totenkopf were the protection. Isolation was central to Iker's project. The Death's Head units trained separately from the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, and from the other SS formations. They developed their own culture, their own hierarchies, their own internal language. This separation was partly practical, a consequence of the camp's locations and functions, but Iker actively reinforced it. He did not want his men contaminated by the conventional military culture of the army, which retained at least the theoretical framework of professional honor codes and the laws of war. Those frameworks were, in Iker's view, weaknesses. The Totenkopf needed to be free of them. He cultivated in his men a contempt for softness and sentimentality that extended not just to the prisoners, but to anyone outside the formation who might question what they did. Wehrmacht officers who expressed discomfort were dismissed as politically unreliable. Civilian officials who raised objections were told that the camps fell outside their jurisdiction. By 1934, the concentration camp network had expanded significantly. Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and other facilities were established, and the Totenkopf expanded with them. Guard battalions deployed across the new system under Iker's centralized authority. He had, in effect, built a small empire within the broader SS structure, answering ultimately to Himmler, but operating with considerable autonomy in the day-to-day running of the camps. The night of the Long Knives, in the summer of 1934, when the SS moved against the leadership of the Brown Shirts on Hitler's orders, demonstrated to Iker and his formation that they were now part of the regime's inner enforcement mechanism. Iker himself participated directly in the killings that night. For the men of the Totenkopf, this was confirmation of their particular status. They were the men who did what needed to be done, without hesitation and without public acknowledgement. The character of the formation during these years was shaped by more than ideology alone. Physical hardship, long hours, and constant exposure to suffering built a kind of callousness that Iker deliberately cultivated. New recruits who showed discomfort at their duties were subjected to pressure from more experienced men, ridiculed for weakness, pushed toward a point where indifference replaced revulsion. The structure of the units reinforced absolute obedience at every level. An NCO who showed leniency toward a prisoner risked punishment as severe as the prisoner would have received. An officer who failed to enforce regulations was suspected of political unreliability. The entire system was designed to make cruelty the path of least resistance, and mercy a punishable deviation. What Ike had created by the mid-1930s was not simply a guard force. It was a military culture in embryonic form, waiting for an opportunity to manifest itself on a larger stage. The men of the Totenkopf Division drilled, trained with weapons, and began to conceive of themselves not merely as guards but as soldiers of a particular and superior kind, freed from the hesitations that weakened conventional military forces. Ike fed this self-conception deliberately. He wanted a formation that would fight with the same absolute commitment it brought to the camps, carrying its ideological purpose into whatever theater of war it was eventually pointed toward. He believed, and worked hard to make his men believe, that the coming conflicts would require exactly the kind of men he had built. The insignia that bound all of this together, the death's head on the collar, the twin lightning bolts of the SS on the other side, carried an accumulating weight of meaning through these years. To wear the Totenkopf was to declare membership in a category of man that stood outside the normal moral order, that had accepted a burden others were too weak or too sentimental to carry. This was the story Ike told his men, and they told it to themselves, and it served a function that ideology always serves. In institutions built on systematic harm, it made the harm not just permissible, but necessary, not just acceptable, but honorable. The men coming out of Dachau, out of Sachsenhausen, out of Buchenwald, carried this framework with them as completely as they carried their weapons. They would carry it onto the battlefields of Poland, of France, of the Soviet Union. They would carry it into situations that concentrated camp duty had not prepared them for, and they would apply it in ways that no one who had not built this formation as carefully and deliberately as Theodore Ike had built it could have fully anticipated. The world outside the camps knew relatively little about what happened inside them in these early years. Some things were whispered, some things were reported in foreign newspapers that the regime dismissed as enemy propaganda. The German public, for the most part, was not invited to look closely, and most did not try to. What mattered to the regime was that the system worked, that opponents were silenced, that the population understood in a general way that resistance had consequences, that the machinery of terror operated smoothly and without embarrassing interruptions. Ike had given the regime exactly that. In return, the regime gave him resources, authority, and space to continue. The Death's Head Guards were building something in those early years, layer by layer, protocol by protocol, and what they built would take the next 12 years to fully express itself in all its catastrophic consequence. By 1934, the scaffolding of a new kind of institution had been erected across the German interior. The concentration camps were no longer improvised holding pens, run by competing factions of stormtroopers and local party officials. They were becoming something more deliberate, more systematic, and far more dangerous. At the center of this transformation stood Theodore Ike, newly appointed inspector of concentration camps and SS Guard formations, a title that carried with it absolute authority over every man, every gate, and every punishment block in the emerging network. Ike had already demonstrated at Dachau what a concentration camp could look like when run with cold administrative precision rather than chaotic brutality. And now, he was given the mandate to replicate that model everywhere. What followed over the next 4 years was not merely the expansion of a prison system. It was the construction of a parallel world, sealed off from ordinary German society, governed entirely by its own rules, and staffed by men being shaped into something the conventional military establishment had never produced before. The Death's Head formation was becoming an institution unto itself. Eike moved quickly. New camps opened in rapid succession across Germany during 1934 and 1935, each one modelled on the Dachau template, with prescribed regulations governing everything from morning roll calls to the precise number of strokes permitted in a formal punishment. Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Flossenburg, and Ravensbrück each came under the administrative umbrella of the SS Totenkopf, the Death's Head units, as the guard formations were formally designated. Eike established regional inspectorates to oversee each camp, ensuring that his regulations were followed with uniformity and that any deviation was swiftly punished. He did not want local commanders improvising. He wanted obedience rendered to a written system, which meant that the system itself became the authority, rather than any individual officer's judgment. This was a crucial psychological feature of the organization he was building. The rules absolved the individual of responsibility while ensuring the machinery kept running, regardless of who operated it. The men recruited into the Totenkopf during these years were drawn from a specific pool. Many were unemployed young men from rural Germany, attracted by steady wages, uniforms, and the status that SS membership conferred in the ideological atmosphere of the mid-1930s. Others were veterans of the street-fighting years, men accustomed to violence as a political instrument. Eike selected for a certain type, not necessarily the most intelligent, but the most reliably obedient, the most ideologically committed, and the most willing to subordinate personal conscience to institutional command. Physical fitness standards were enforced rigorously. Recruits underwent months of drill, political instruction, and weapons training in a regime that deliberately cut them off from civilian contact. They lived in barracks, ate together, trained together, and were reminded daily that their loyalty was owed first to Heinrich Himmler, then to Eike, and only then to abstract concepts of nation and race. Personal relationships outside the unit were tolerated but not encouraged. The formation was designed to be self-referential, a community that validated its own norms without external challenge. What made Eike's method particularly effective was the way he married ideological instruction to the daily mechanics of camp service. Guards were not simply told to watch prisoners. They were told why those prisoners were there, what they represented, and why ordinary sentiments of pity or mercy were not virtues but weaknesses. The prisoners were presented as enemies of the German people, as racial and political threats requiring containment. A guard who felt compassion was not being humane, in Eike's telling. He was being dangerous, a potential weak point in the system. This framing allowed Eike to present cruelty not as a moral failing, but as professional discipline. Men who might have hesitated to mistreat another human being in ordinary circumstances were gradually conditioned to see that hesitation as the aberration. The camp environment reinforced this daily. The prisoners' degradation was visible, constant, and institutional. Guards were surrounded by evidence of a world in which the boundaries between persons were fixed and impermeable, between those who held power and those who had forfeited all claim to it. Punishment within the Totenkopf was equally systematic. Eike demanded total obedience from his guards, as insistently as he demanded the domination of prisoners, and any guard who disobeyed orders, showed weakness, or engaged in unauthorized behavior faced formal punishment through the SS disciplinary apparatus. Men could be demoted, imprisoned, or expelled. The threat of punishment ran in both directions. Guards who were too lenient toward prisoners risked censure, but so did those who acted in genuinely undisciplined ways that drew unwanted attention. The goal was controlled brutality, violence directed by the institution, not personal impulse. This distinction mattered enormously to Iker. He was not building a mob. He was building a disciplined force that happened to operate through terror. The difference, in his conception, was everything. Isolated from the regular German army, which the SS leadership viewed with a mixture of institutional envy and ideological contempt, the Totenkopfverbände developed their own military traditions almost from scratch. Army officers occasionally provided instruction, but the Wehrmacht establishment was deeply uncomfortable with the SS formations, regarding them as politically compromised and insufficiently trained by professional standards. This friction produced, paradoxically, an intensification of Iker's insistence on a separate identity. He told his men that they were something the army could not understand, that they were the ideological soldiers of the movement, rather than mere servants of the state. This was not purely rhetorical. It had practical consequences for how the formation trained, how it understood its purpose, and how it would later fight. Men who believe they belong to a chosen vanguard behave differently on a battlefield than men who understand themselves as interchangeable parts of a national defense apparatus. Between 1935 and 1938, the Totenkopfverbände grew substantially. By the time the camp network had expanded to encompass a significant fraction of Germany's political and racial prisoners, the guard formations numbered in the thousands. Iker reorganized them into numbered Death's Head Standarten, or regiments, each assigned to a cluster of camps and responsible for maintaining the guard rosters, the administrative records, and the punishment apparatus at those facilities. This regimental structure gave the formation a military shape, even before it had a genuinely military mission, providing rank hierarchies, unit pride, and the organizational vocabulary that would later be used when the transition to armed combat was demanded. The men who would eventually wear the Death's Head insignia on an active battlefield had already spent years wearing it at a concentration camp gate. The insignia carried meaning before it carried military distinction, and that prior meaning never fully disappeared. The relationship between the Totenkopf guards and their prisoners created psychological consequences that shaped the formation in ways that were not always visible in the administrative records. Day after day, guards exercised total power over men and women who had no recourse. They observed degradation, administered punishments, and participated in a system explicitly designed to break human beings. Some guards became numb, others became sadistic. Many fell somewhere between those states, performing the required actions with the mechanical efficiency that institutional routine makes possible. What Iker had built was a system expert at insulating its participants from the full weight of what they were doing, distributing responsibility across a chain of orders, regulations, and procedures so diffuse that individual culpability became nearly invisible. This psychological architecture would prove highly portable. When these men went to war, they carried the architecture with them. Iker also cultivated personal loyalty with remarkable effectiveness. He presented himself to his men as a protector, a commander who would shield them from outside criticism and defend their interests against the Wehrmacht establishment, the party bureaucracy, and any other institution that questioned their methods or their standing. In return, he demanded not merely obedience, but devotion. He toured the camps regularly, spoke with ordinary guards, and maintained a paternal relationship with the formation that reinforced the sense that the Totenkopf was a family as much as a military unit. This was not incidental to his leadership style. It was central to it. Men who love their commander will endure privations that would destroy a unit held together only by formal discipline. They will also commit acts they might refuse from a commander they merely feared. The bond Eike created between himself and the Death's Head formations was one of the most consequential features of the unit he was constructing. By 1937 and 1938, as Germany's geopolitical ambitions began to accelerate, and the prospect of military conflict moved from theoretical to probable, the Totenkopfverbände stood at an inflection point. Himmler had never intended the Death's Head formations to remain purely a policing and camp-guarding apparatus. He envisioned a future in which the SS would field armed formations capable of operating alongside the Wehrmacht in genuine combat. Eike shared this ambition, perhaps even more intensely, because for him, military respectability was personal. He had spent years building a formation that the army establishment regarded as beneath serious consideration, and he burned with the desire to prove them wrong. The men he had trained in isolation, indoctrinated with ideology, and tempered in the daily administration of a system of terror, were, in his estimation, harder and more committed than anything the conventional military could produce. Whether the coming wars would validate that conviction remained to be seen. What was certain was that the foundation had been laid, stone by deliberate stone, over 4 years of concentrated effort, and the men standing guard at the gates of Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald were no longer merely prison warders. They were the beginning of something else entirely. By the middle years of the 1930s, the world beyond Germany's borders was changing faster than most could follow. Nations were rearming. Old treaties were fraying at their edges. And within the Third Reich, the men who had built their careers behind camp walls began to look outward, toward a horizon they had not yet been permitted to reach. Theodor Eike had spent years constructing something precise and durable, a system of authority, a culture of obedience, a force that answered to no one but itself. Now the question was no longer whether that force could hold a perimeter. The question was whether it could take one. The year 1938 reshaped the political geography of Europe with a speed that startled even seasoned observers. Germany absorbed Austria in March, in the action known as the Anschluss, and the march of German forces into Vienna was greeted not with resistance, but with crowds and flowers. Within months, the Sudetenland followed. The Wehrmacht moved, and the world watched. For the SS leadership, these events represented something more than territorial gain. They were proof that armed SS formations, however controversial within the German military establishment, had a role in the new order that was coming. Himmler pressed the argument hard in the corridors of power. The SS required an armed component capable of operating alongside conventional forces, distinct from both the regular army and the police. The answer came, not as a single decision, but as a gradual opening of doors, each one wider than the last. For Eike, the shift was both vindicating and complicated. His Totenkopf units had always occupied an awkward institutional space, too military in their discipline and bearing to be dismissed as mere prison wardens, yet too closely associated with the camp system to be embraced by the Wehrmacht as equals. The Anschluss and the broader remilitarization of the SS gave him leverage he had not previously possessed. New formations could be raised. New equipment could be requisitioned. The scattered guard battalions that had until now existed primarily to maintain the camp network could be reorganized into something that looked, moved, and trained like a genuine fighting force. It was an opportunity Eike seized with the methodical ferocity that defined everything he touched. The structural reorganization that followed was neither swift nor seamless. Across Germany and the newly expanded Reich, Totenkopf Guard battalions were evaluated, restructured, and in many cases, fundamentally retrained. The older men, those who had come up through the camp system in the early years, whose habits were formed in watchtowers and punishment yards, presented a particular challenge. They knew how to enforce authority in a closed environment against prisoners who had no recourse. They did not know how to maneuver under fire, coordinate with artillery, or sustain operations across open ground. Aki understood this limitation, even if he rarely admitted it publicly. The solution was not to discard the older cadre, whose ideological reliability he trusted above almost everything else, but to dilute their dominance with fresh blood. Recruitment accelerated sharply in 1938 and continued into 1939. The men now being brought into the Totenkopf units were younger, in many cases still in their late teens or early 20s, raw enough to be shaped from the beginning rather than retrained from old habits. The SS selection criteria remained demanding on paper, emphasizing physical standards, racial classification requirements, and political reliability. But as the need for numbers grew, standards that had once been applied with rigid consistency began to flex. What remained non-negotiable was ideological commitment, a willingness to accept, internalize, and act upon the worldview that Aki and his superiors had been cultivating for years. The young recruits who entered the Totenkopf in this period did not arrive at a neutral military organization. They arrived at an institution that understood itself as a political weapon, and they were trained accordingly. The training itself underwent a significant transformation during this period. For years, the instruction provided to Totenkopf personnel had been oriented almost entirely toward internal security, controlling prisoners, maintaining order in enclosed spaces, executing punishments. What was now required was something categorically different: the fundamentals of infantry tactics, weapons handling across a broader range of armaments, coordination between units in the field, and the physical endurance demanded by sustained military operations. Training camps were established and expanded. Exercise schedules grew longer and harder. Men who had never contemplated maneuvering under simulated fire were drilled until the movements became reflex. The process was imperfect, rushed, and conducted under the pressure of an international situation that left little time for the gradual refinement of skills. But it produced, within a notably compressed time frame, men who could at least approximate the basic competencies of soldiers. The relationship between this emerging formation and the Wehrmacht remained genuinely uneasy throughout this period. Army commanders viewed the SS armed units with a combination of professional skepticism and institutional jealousy. The Wehrmacht had its own traditions, its own officer corps, its own understanding of what military professionalism meant, and it did not easily accommodate the idea of parallel formations that operated under different chains of command and answered to different masters. Eike, for his part, had no interest in subordinating his formation to army control. The friction was structural, not merely personal. Two competing visions of armed force within the same state were colliding, and neither side was willing to yield more than it was forced to. Equipment and logistics presented their own persistent difficulties. The Totenkopf units entering this expansion phase were not equipped to the standard of frontline Wehrmacht divisions. They competed for weapons, vehicles, and supplies against an army that had prior claim to the production lines and the quartermaster networks. Eike used every avenue available to him: personal appeals to Himmler, bureaucratic pressure, outright confrontation with army procurement officials, to close the gap. Progress was uneven. Some units received adequate weaponry and made meaningful advances in their training. Others continued to operate with shortfalls that no amount of ideological motivation could compensate for in a genuine firefight. The division that would eventually be fielded was stronger in some respects than it appeared on paper, and weaker in others. Through all of this, Ike maintained a relentless insistence on the cultural identity of his force. The Totenkopf was not, in his conception, simply a military unit that happened to wear SS insignia. It was the embodiment of a particular idea, that ideological commitment, ruthlessness, and absolute loyalty to the SS and its leadership represented a form of fighting spirit that conventional armies could not replicate. This belief permeated the lectures, the ceremonies, the rituals of unit life that he imposed and encouraged. Men were reminded constantly of who they were, what they stood for, and what distinguished them from the soldiers of the Wehrmacht. Whether this indoctrination produced better fighters was a question the coming war would answer. What it unquestionably produced was a body of men who understood themselves as different, set apart not merely by their uniform, but by a sense of mission that blurred the line between military service and ideological crusade. By the summer of 1939, the transformation from a camp guard organization to a recognizable military formation was substantially, if imperfectly, complete. Several reinforced Totenkopf regiments now existed, organized along broadly conventional lines, capable of moving and operating as coherent tactical units. They had artillery attachments, support elements, and an officer corps that, however much it reflected the particular culture Ike had built, was at least conversant with the vocabulary and practice of military command. The men filling the ranks had completed their basic training and received their ideological instruction in roughly equal measure. What they had not done was face an enemy who fired back with real ammunition across real ground. That education was imminent. The mobilization orders that began circulating in the final weeks of August 1939 brought the entire structure to a point of reckoning. The machinery that Ike had built over years, the battalions, the training programs, the layered hierarchies of command and control, was about to encounter the one test that no amount of preparation could fully simulate. Poland lay across the border, the Wehrmacht was moving, and the SS Totenkopf, still finding its footing as a military organization, was moving with it. The men who marched out of their training grounds in those late summer days of 1939 were neither the experienced soldiers of a veteran army nor the simple prison guards they had once been. They were something the world had not quite seen before, and the world was about to find out what that meant. The summer of 1939 moved fast. Across Germany, mobilization orders rippled outward from Berlin like a current through wire, and the men of the Totenkopf formation felt the pull of it differently from other soldiers. They had spent years inside the fences, not outside them. Their world had been watchtowers and roll calls, punishment blocks, and the enforced silence of men who had learned to stop flinching. Now, the fences were coming down, not for the prisoners, but for the guards. Theodor Eicke had spent half a decade forging these men into something he believed was harder than steel and more reliable than conscience. By late August of that year, he was about to find out whether he was right. The mobilization order brought with it a surge of violent energy that had been building inside the formation for years, energy that had no proper outlet in a concentration camp, and now, suddenly, had one. Poland lay to the east, and Germany was moving. The formation Eicke assembled was not, by the standards of the professional Wehrmacht, a polished instrument. Its officers had risen through the SS hierarchy on the strength of ideological loyalty and personal brutality rather than military schooling. Many of its senior non-commissioned ranks had served longer as jailers than as soldiers, and the habits of coercion they had learned in the camps were deeply embedded. When conventional army commanders looked at the Totenkopf in those final days of August 1939, what they saw gave some of them pause. The unit carried its own distinct culture, its own internal language of absolute authority and punitive obedience, and it regarded the Wehrmacht's more formal military conventions with something close to contempt. Eike had taught his men to believe they were something apart, not simply soldiers, but ideological warriors in a struggle that transcended ordinary military service. That belief would define every action they took once they crossed the border. Germany's invasion of Poland began in the grey pre-dawn hours of the 1st of September, 1939. The initial assault fell to the Wehrmacht's regular divisions, armoured formations, and infantry that had trained for precisely this kind of high-tempo operational warfare. The Totenkopf Division was not part of the initial spearhead. Instead, it followed behind the advancing front, assigned to rear area security duties in the zones the fighting had already passed through. This was not, on the surface, a glamorous assignment, but it was one the formation was in certain dark respects uniquely prepared for. Rear area security, in the language of the Nazi campaign against Poland, meant something very specific. It meant the suppression of any real or imagined resistance, the pacification of civilian populations, and the implementation of policies directed against Jews, intellectuals, and anyone else the regime had designated as an enemy. The Totenkopf arrived in Poland carrying those orders in its institutional memory, encoded in the years of doctrine Eike had pressed into it. What followed in those first weeks of September was a cascade of violence directed at Polish civilians and captured soldiers that distinguished the Totenkopf from even the other SS formations operating in the country. The unit moved through towns and villages with the procedural confidence of men who had managed populations through terror before. Mass arrests, public executions, the burning of properties. These were not the chaotic byproducts of combat confusion. They were organized actions, carried out by men who understood how to process human beings through systems of coercion. Documented massacres occurred in several locations as the unit swept through rear areas, targeting Polish civilians, including Jews, and members of the Polish intelligentsia. Wehrmacht officers who encountered these operations were not always passive observers. Some protested, at times formally, but the SS formations operated with enough autonomy from Army Command that these protests carried limited weight. The machinery had its own momentum. One episode above all others from the Polish campaign would crystallize the Totenkopf's reputation within the Wehrmacht, and later before the courts. In a Polish town, in the first weeks of the campaign, soldiers from the unit shot a significant number of civilians and Polish prisoners of war in circumstances that bore no resemblance to combat necessity. The victims included wounded men. The perpetrators carried out the killing with the organized, unhurried deliberation of men who believed they had authority, and that the authority was legitimate. When army officers lodged formal complaints about the Totenkopf's conduct in Poland, the cases moved upward through the command chain and then, in most instances, quietly stopped moving. Heinrich Himmler protected his formations. The men responsible faced, at worst, internal SS inquiries that produced neither punishment nor any meaningful acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The lesson embedded itself into the formation's identity, that the normal constraints on conduct did not apply to them. Eike moved through his formation during those September weeks with the energy of a man who believed history was vindicating him. He had argued for years that the Totenkopf should be given the resources and recognition of a frontline military division rather than being treated as a specialized police force. The campaign in Poland, in his view, was the opportunity to prove that point. He pushed his officers hard, demanding initiative and aggression, and he interpreted rear area security operations as consistent with the military mission rather than separate from it. In Ike's vision, the Polish population, and particularly Polish Jews, were not bystanders to a military campaign. They were part of the enemy that Germany was fighting, and treating them as such was not a crime, but a duty. This framing was not unique to Ike in the fall of 1939, but it found in his formation a particularly concentrated and willing audience. The Polish campaign lasted roughly 5 weeks before organized military resistance effectively collapsed. In that time, the Totenkopf conducted operations across a wide arc of central Poland, and the pattern of violence it established was already drawing attention from within the German military itself. A formal complaint from a senior army officer about the killing of civilians and prisoners of war reached high levels of command and named Totenkopf personnel specifically. The complaint was, in a bureaucratic sense, taken seriously enough to generate paperwork. Himmler's response was to defend his men, and the matter was eventually set aside. No prosecutions followed. The episode illustrated with uncomfortable clarity the relationship between the SS formations and military law in the early war period, a relationship in which ideology functioned as a permanent override on legal accountability. By the time the fighting in Poland wound down in October of 1939, the Totenkopf Division had not distinguished itself in set-piece battle. It had not stormed fortified positions or crossed rivers under fire, or demonstrated the tactical qualities that the Wehrmacht's panzer commanders were already being celebrated for. What it had demonstrated was something else: a capacity for organized, sustained violence against non-combatants, carried out with institutional coherence and without significant internal resistance from within the unit. Some individual soldiers may have felt unease. The historical record preserves fragments of testimony that suggest the operations troubled certain men, but the formation as a whole performed the role it had been trained for. The concentration camp years had not been wasted, from Ike's perspective. They had produced men who could carry out orders in morally extreme circumstances without the mechanisms of ordinary conscience disrupting the process. Poland also gave the Totenkopf its first genuine experience of military logistics and operational movement at scale, and the results were mixed. Supply chains proved unreliable, vehicle maintenance exposed serious gaps in technical training, and the coordination between Totenkopf units and Wehrmacht formations was frequently awkward. Regular army officers found SS command styles erratic, and in some cases, recklessly indifferent to orthodox tactical considerations. The Totenkopf officers, for their part, resented what they experienced as condescension from a conventional military establishment that did not understand or value the ideological dimension of the struggle they believed they were fighting. These frictions would persist and intensify throughout the war, but in the fall of 1939, they were already visible, a structural fault line running through the German military apparatus. The men who survived the Polish campaign returned to Germany in the late autumn, carrying something they had not possessed before: operational experience, however incomplete, and the particular psychological weight of what they had done and seen. For some, the campaign had confirmed the ideology they had been trained in, had, in a sense, made it real and tangible. For others, the reality of organized killing may have created pressures that could not be easily resolved within the formation's culture of silence and obedience. The Totenkopf did not encourage its members to reflect critically on their conduct. It encouraged them to see themselves as necessary instruments of a historic mission, and the division between those two orientations, reflection and mission, was where the formation's moral character, or rather its absence, had been deliberately constructed. Eicke used the period following the Polish campaign to press Himmler and the SS command for upgraded status and resources. He wanted the Totenkopf recognized as a full military division with all the equipment and organizational structure that designation implied. He wanted tanks, artillery, and the institutional prestige that would put his formation on equal footing with the Wehrmacht's elite units. What the Polish campaign had shown him was that his men could operate in the field and carry out their assigned tasks. What they needed now, in his assessment, was the material foundation to become something more than a security formation. The SS command was largely receptive. Germany was not finished with war. France loomed on the horizon, and after France, something larger still. The Death's Head formation that had marched into Poland as glorified jailers was being retooled, hardened, and aimed at a wider horizon. Whether the lessons it had taken from Poland were the right lessons for what was coming, no one at the time seemed inclined to ask. What the Polish campaign ultimately established was a template. Not a template for tactical excellence, not a model of operational efficiency, but a template for the relationship between ideology and action that would define the Totenkopf through every campaign that followed. The unit had learned that it could kill outside the context of direct combat. It had learned that authority could be invoked to legitimize violence against the helpless, and that the institutional structures around it would absorb, deflect, and ultimately protect the men who carried out that violence. In the years ahead, on much larger stages, with far greater consequences, those lessons would be applied again and again. Poland was not a chapter the formation left behind when it turned westward in the spring of 1940. It was the foundation on which everything that followed was built. By the spring of 1940, the war in the West had stalled into something almost theatrical. Months had passed since the fall of Poland, and yet the anticipated clash between Germany and the Western Allies had not come. French soldiers sat behind the Maginot Line, drinking wine and playing cards. British troops dug shallow trenches in Belgian mud and waited. The newspapers called it the drôle de guerre, the phony war, as though the whole catastrophe might somehow dissolve back into diplomacy if everyone held still long enough. But in the staging areas east of the Rhine, nothing was still. Armor was moving, fuel was being stockpiled, and divisions that had spent months training and reorganizing were being fed into position. Among them was the SS Totenkopf Division, hardened by its experience in Poland and burning with something its men had been taught to call purpose. The offensive that would shatter the Western Front began in the early hours of the 10th of May 1940. German forces poured into the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg simultaneously, and within days, the entire Allied defensive strategy was unraveling. The Totenkopf Division did not lead the initial assault. In the opening phase, the division was held in reserve, assigned to follow behind the armored spearheads of Army Group B as a motorized infantry force, available to reinforce or exploit wherever the situation demanded. This secondary role frustrated many of the division's officers, who believed their men had earned a place at the cutting edge of the advance. But the frustration would not last long. The collapse of Allied resistance along the Meuse and the extraordinary success of the armored thrust through the Ardennes meant that within days, the entire operational picture had changed beyond recognition, and the Totenkopf found itself moving west at speed. As German panzer divisions raced toward the Channel coast, The strategic situation for the Allies became desperate, with a speed that no one on either side had quite predicted. The British Expeditionary Force and large elements of the French army found themselves cut off from their supply lines and pressed from multiple directions. It was in this chaotic, fluid environment that the Totenkopf Division entered its first serious combat in the West, moving up through northern France and into the area around Cambrai and then northwest toward the coast. The roads were clogged with refugees, broken vehicles, and retreating soldiers from a dozen different armies. The division pushed through it all with the blunt force that Ike had spent years cultivating. Resistance was met head-on rather than outflanked, a tendency that reflected the ideological aggression bred into the unit as much as any tactical calculation. By mid-May, the division had made contact with British rearguard formations, attempting to slow the German advance and cover the general withdrawal toward the coast. These early engagements were costly in both directions. The British soldiers of the rearguard were not the demoralized, fleeing troops that German propaganda would later describe. They fought with a disciplined ferocity that the Totenkopf's men found surprising, and the division suffered meaningful casualties in personnel and vehicles, in engagements that lasted hours rather than minutes. German after-action reports from this period acknowledge the effectiveness of British anti-tank fire and the coordination of infantry and artillery that cost the division dearly in the approach to several defended positions. For a formation that had spent years being told it was qualitatively superior to any enemy it would face, the reality of fighting a professional army came as something of a corrective. It was during these weeks of fighting in northern France that the most damning episode of the entire Western campaign occurred, an episode that would follow the Totenkopf's reputation for the rest of the war and far beyond it. Near the town of Le Paradis, in late May of 1940, soldiers of the division encountered a group of British prisoners who had surrendered after a sustained defensive action. What followed was not combat. The prisoners, numbering close to 100 men from a Royal Norfolk Regiment battalion, were assembled in a field, and machine guns were turned on them. Survivors were finished with bayonets. The massacre at Le Paradis was not an isolated act of battlefield rage. It was systematic, carried out by men who had been trained for years to see their enemies as something less than fully human. The officer responsible was later tried after the war and executed for the crime. But the act itself cannot be separated from the institutional culture that produced it, a culture built at Dachau and refined in Poland and carried westward in May 1940 as methodically as any rifle or field gun. The Totenkopf's combat performance during the push to the coast was a study in contrasts. Effective enough in a blunt tactical sense, but characterized by an approach that alarmed Wehrmacht officers who observed it. Regular army commanders noted that the division's officers were willing to accept casualty rates that conventional military thinking would have considered unacceptable for the objectives gained. Ike's doctrine of absolute aggression, of never pausing, never yielding, and treating any cost as worthwhile if forward momentum was maintained, produced soldiers who fought with genuine ferocity, but sometimes without the economy of effort that separates competent military leadership from mere brutality. Wehrmacht generals filed reports expressing concern not just about conduct toward prisoners, but about the operational judgment being applied at the unit's command level. The friction between the Totenkopf and regular army structures was not new, but the Western campaign sharpened it considerably. Wehrmacht officers who had tolerated the SS formations at a distance during the Polish campaign now found themselves in shared operational areas with units that answered to a separate chain of command and seemed to regard Wehrmacht authority with something between indifference and contempt. Eicke was openly dismissive of army generals who questioned his methods, and his correspondence from this period makes clear that he viewed conventional military commanders as obstacles to be managed, rather than superiors to be obeyed. The Wehrmacht, for its part, was caught between its instinct to assert authority and its awareness that the SS formations answered ultimately not to military command structures, but to Heinrich Himmler and, beyond him, to Hitler himself. As the encirclement around Dunkirk tightened through late May and into early June of 1940, the Totenkopf Division was among the German forces pressing against the Allied perimeter. The fighting around the Dunkirk pocket was some of the most intense of the entire French campaign. Allied forces defending the perimeter knew they were fighting for time, buying hours and days for the evacuation that was taking place across the Channel beaches. They fought accordingly, with the focused desperation of men who understood exactly what was at stake. Against these defenders, the Totenkopf pushed hard, and the division paid heavily for every kilometer of ground it gained. British and French units in the perimeter defense included some of the most experienced soldiers of the Allied armies, and they made the approaches to the town costly for every German formation that pressed them. The evacuation itself, the extraordinary operation that lifted more than 300,000 Allied soldiers from the beaches and harbour of Dunkirk across the Channel to England, was occurring under conditions of almost surreal chaos. German armour had been halted by the famous stop order issued days earlier, a decision that remains contested by historians to this day, and the ground assault had fallen primarily to infantry and motorized divisions. The Totenkopf was one of these formations, pressing against the defensive perimeter while Luftwaffe aircraft contested the air above the beaches, and Allied destroyers and civilian vessels formed their improbable fleet. By the time the evacuation was complete and Dunkirk fell, the strategic damage to Britain was less than it might have been. The men who escaped would fight again. When France capitulated and the armistice was signed in late June of 1940, the Totenkopf Division had been in combat for less than 2 months in the West. Yet those weeks had transformed the unit in ways that went beyond simple battlefield experience. The division had proven capable of sustained combat operations against professional armies, had taken and inflicted significant casualties, and had demonstrated that the years of training under Eicke had produced something genuinely dangerous. But the same weeks had also confirmed, in the clearest possible terms, that the Totenkopf was not simply a military formation in the conventional sense. The massacre at Le Paradis, the conduct toward prisoners in other engagements, and the persistent friction with Wehrmacht command structures all pointed to a unit whose military effectiveness and criminal behavior were not separate phenomena, but aspects of the same institutional identity, shaped by the same doctrine and the same ideology. For the men of the Totenkopf themselves, the fall of France felt like vindication. They had fought in a campaign that had humiliated the armies of France and Britain, forced an evacuation that their commanders would spin as a victory, but which was unmistakably a defeat, and contributed to what seemed to be a total transformation of European power. The flags and the speeches and the newsreel footage all said the same thing. Germany had won, and they had been part of it. What the victory parades did not say, what the ideological speeches at unit formations could not quite address, was that the enemies defeated in France would not stay defeated. Across the Channel, the men who had escaped through Dunkirk were already being reorganized. And to the east, beyond any frontier that the Totenkopf soldiers could yet see on a map, something vastly larger and more terrible than France was waiting. The Western campaign was not an ending, it was preparation. There are commanders who shape their units through discipline alone, and there are commanders who shape them through belief. Theodor Eicke was the second kind. He had not built the Totenkopf Division simply to fight. He had built it to embody something, to become a living proof of what he believed National Socialist soldiery could be. By the time the division completed its brutal trial in France and settled into occupation duties in the summer of 1940, Eicke was not merely a general in the conventional sense. He was, to the men under his command, something closer to a founding father, severe, consuming, and entirely certain of his own vision. That certainty was both the source of the division's ferocious cohesion and the seed of nearly every conflict it would generate with the broader German military establishment. Eicke was a difficult man. Those who knew him well, and there were not many he permitted to know him well, described a personality of extremes, generous and paternal toward loyal subordinates one moment, coldly ruthless toward perceived enemies or failures the next. His temperament had been forged long before the war, in the years he spent managing concentration camps with an almost liturgical sense of purpose. At Dachau, in 1933, he had not just administered a prison, he had designed a system, crafted regulations, and trained guards to think of themselves as soldiers in an ideological war, rather than ordinary prison warders. That mindset traveled with him into conventional military command, and it never left. Where other divisional commanders might measure success in ground taken or casualties inflicted, Eicke measured it in part by whether his men still believed, whether the ideological fire he had spent years kindling remained lit under the weight of combat and cold and exhaustion. His relationship with Heinrich Himmler was the cornerstone upon which much of his authority rested. Himmler regarded Eicke with a complicated mixture of personal affection and institutional need. Eicke had been utterly loyal, had executed the tasks Himmler required in the concentration camp system with brutal efficiency, and had transformed a collection of guard battalions into a genuine military formation, largely through force of personal will. Himmler valued that. But Eicke was not an easy subordinate. He argued, demanded, wrote long and agitated memoranda when he felt the division was being slighted, and had a talent for making himself personally offensive to anyone he believed was undervaluing his men's contributions. Within the SS hierarchy, he occupied a position that was simultaneously privileged and precarious, too useful to ignore, too abrasive to entirely trust. The regular army, the Wehrmacht, was another matter entirely. The friction between Eicke's Totenkopf Division and the conventional German military establishment was not incidental. It was structural, rooted in competing visions of what soldiering was and what war was for. Wehrmacht commanders who encountered Eicke found a man who believed that his division answered to a different and higher calling than the professional military could comprehend. He dismissed the army's traditions, its emphasis on technical skill and measured conduct, as the inheritance of a class system that National Socialism had made obsolete. His men, he insisted, were not merely better trained or better motivated than Wehrmacht soldiers. They were fundamentally different, soldiers of an idea rather than soldiers of a state. Senior army officers found this attitude both irritating and genuinely alarming, and their complaints about SS conduct, particularly in rear area operations, generated persistent institutional friction that followed the division throughout its first year of combat. After the French campaign, as the division settled into its occupation role in the summer of 1940, Eicke turned his considerable energy toward rebuilding and expanding. The fighting in France had been the division's first extended test, and the results had been mixed enough to make him urgent about improvement. Casualties had been significant, equipment had been worn hard, and certain engagements had exposed weaknesses in coordination and tactical flexibility that Eicke could not attribute solely to bad luck. He was not a man who accepted failure graciously, but he was, to his credit, capable of absorbing lessons when the evidence was clear enough. The occupation period became, under his direction, something between a refitting operation and a military school. Training intensified. New men were absorbed into existing units and subjected to the full force of the division's ideological indoctrination program, and Ike lobbied aggressively within SS channels for heavier weapons and enhanced panzer capabilities. The ideological indoctrination that Ike demanded was not a supplement to military training. It was, in his understanding, the foundation of it. Every aspect of the division's daily routine carried ideological weight. The lectures, the unit ceremonies, the particular vocabulary of orders and briefings, all of it was designed to reinforce the conviction that these men were fighting a struggle unlike any conventional war, that the enemies they faced were not simply opposing armies, but existential threats to a racial order that only they, the Totenkopf, fully understood and fully defended. Ike believed, with what appeared to be complete sincerity, that a soldier who understood why he was fighting would fight harder and endure more than one who fought for pay or profession. Whether this was true in any measurable tactical sense, it was surely true that the Totenkopf Division exhibited a battlefield stubbornness, a refusal to yield ground even under conditions that would have prompted more conventional units to withdraw, that impressed and unnerved opponents in equal measure. His vision for the division as an elite formation, distinct from and superior to the Wehrmacht in spirit, if not always in equipment, drove Ike into repeated confrontations with army commanders over questions of deployment and command authority. He resented deeply any suggestion that the Totenkopf should be subordinated to army formations in ways that diminished its independent identity, and he fought those arrangements with a persistence that bordered on obsession. He wrote to Himmler, complained to SS adjutants, and on occasion made his displeasure known directly and ungraciously to army officers who outranked him. Some of these confrontations were petty and counterproductive, driven more by ego than by any genuine operational concern. Others reflected a real institutional problem. The SS divisions occupied an ambiguous position in the German command structure, formerly under Wehrmacht operational control in the field, but answerable to a separate chain of authority for everything else, creating contradictions that no amount of goodwill could entirely resolve. Within the division itself, Ike's authority was absolute in ways that went beyond formal military rank. He knew names, knew records, involved himself personally in matters of promotion and punishment to a degree unusual even by the standards of the time. Officers who pleased him were rewarded with fierce loyalty and active championing of their careers through SS channels. Officers who failed him, or who showed what he interpreted as insufficient commitment, faced consequences that could be swift and disproportionate. This system created a command culture defined by personal allegiance rather than institutional process, a culture that produced high cohesion in some circumstances and dangerous rigidity in others. Men advanced not always because they were the most tactically gifted, but because they had demonstrated the particular combination of ideological fervor and personal loyalty that Ike prized above other qualities. His relationship with his men, the ordinary soldiers of the division, had a quality that few commanders managed, and that those who served under him described with a consistency too uniform to dismiss. He appeared among them regularly, without ceremony, talked to them directly, remembered individual soldiers across weeks and months of campaigning. He ate the same food during difficult periods, shared the same physical discomfort with what seemed like genuine indifference to personal comfort. Whatever else Ike was, and the list of what else he was, is long and dark. He was not a man who commanded from a distance. His soldiers' fierce attachment to him was real, and it was earned in the most direct possible way, by presence, by attention, and by the visible conviction that what they were doing together mattered beyond any ordinary military objective. By the autumn of 1940, with the division rebuilt and the Soviet Union looming as the next theater, Eicke's ambition for the Totenkopf had taken on a quality of urgency. He understood, or believed he understood, that the coming campaign would be the one by which the division would be finally and permanently judged. France had been a beginning, Poland had been a rehearsal. What lay east, across the vast and unforgiving geography that German strategic planning had already begun to treat as both a military objective and an ideological battlefield, was the real test. He pushed the training harder, argued more forcefully for equipment allocations, and delivered speeches to his officers that made no separation between military preparation and ideological conviction. For Eicke, the two were the same enterprise, expressed in different registers. The contradictions embedded in Eicke's command were not invisible to everyone around him. There were officers within the division who were uncomfortable with aspects of what he required, who understood the difference between military ferocity and criminal behavior without always being in a position to act on that understanding. There were Wehrmacht commanders who watched the Totenkopf with a professional unease that went beyond institutional rivalry. And there were moments, even within the protected enclosure of the division's internal culture, when the gap between the ideal Eicke preached and the reality his methods produced became visible enough to generate private doubt. But doubt, in the Totenkopf's culture, had no official language. The structure Eicke had built was one in which certainty was rewarded, and questioning was, at best, a private matter. What Eicke had created, by the end of the first year of combat, was something that could not be evaluated in purely military terms. The Totenkopf Division was a fighting formation of genuine and terrible effectiveness, shaped by a commander whose intensity of belief had transferred, through years of concentrated effort, into the bones of the institution. It was also a formation whose very effectiveness was inseparable from the ideology that produced it, an ideology that had already, in Poland and in France, expressed itself in crimes for which there was no military justification. The man and the division he made were a single piece, and understanding either required holding both truths at the same time, that Eicke built something formidable, and that the thing he built carried within it, from its very foundation, the seeds of a particular and deliberate darkness. The summer of 1940 brought a peculiar kind of exhaustion to the men of the Totenkopf Division. They had tasted victory. The campaigns in Poland and France had transformed them from concentration camp guards into soldiers who had proven themselves capable of rapid movement, aggressive combat, and sustained operational effectiveness against organized military forces. Yet the victory itself created a strange pause. The Wehrmacht had achieved what seemed impossible only months before, the destruction of French military power and the subjugation of Western Europe. For the Totenkopf, scattered across occupied France in garrison towns and requisitioned barracks, this victory opened a window of time that would prove far more consequential than the glorious blur of the conquest itself. Theodor Eicke understood what this moment meant. His division, numbering somewhere in the vicinity of 4,000 men when the French campaign ended, would not be allowed to rest in comfortable occupation. The Nazi regime's ideological objectives and Hitler's strategic ambitions demanded expansion, reconstitution, and ruthless preparation for the next phase of warfare. Even as French civilians watched German soldiers occupy their towns, Eicke began the process of transforming his unit from a relatively small, specialized force of combat-hardened veterans into something far larger and more conventionally militarized. The concentration camp guards who had formed the core of the division would now become cadre for an organization that could field multiple panzer companies, expanded artillery batteries, and significantly enlarged infantry formations. Between 1940 and 1941, the Totenkopf would roughly double in size, absorbing thousands of new recruits who had never guarded concentration camps, many of whom had no experience in the SS at all. The recruitment process began almost immediately after the French armistice. The SS threw open its doors to a far broader population than had previously been the case. Young men from across the Reich volunteered or were transferred into SS ranks with a promise of elite status and superior equipment. Many came from the Hitler Youth, indoctrinated from childhood, but without practical military experience. Others were transferred from the Wehrmacht or other SS formations. The Totenkopf's reputation, burnished by their aggressive conduct in Poland and their ferocity in France, made recruitment easier. The division represented something appealing to young Germans in 1940, an elite formation associated with victory, ideological commitment, and a sense of belonging to Germany's vanguard. The brutal reality of what the division had actually done, the atrocities and war crimes that had already begun to accumulate, remained largely obscured from the general German population. Recruitment propaganda emphasized military prowess, the strength of the SS, and the historical significance of being part of the Nazi revolution. Yet absorption of these new men created profound challenges within the division's structure and culture. The older guard personnel, the men who had served under Eicke at Dachau and through the Polish campaign, recognized that their unit was being fundamentally altered. The intimate brutality of the concentration camp system, the absolute obedience that came from years of isolation and ideological indoctrination in that closed world, could not be replicated through standard military training alone. The newer recruits brought different backgrounds, different levels of indoctrination, and different relationships to authority. Some were genuine ideological enthusiasts, but others were simply young men responding to recruitment calls or transfers from other units. Eicke and his officers faced a critical task. They had to integrate these thousands of new men while preserving the division's ideological coherence and combat effectiveness. This would prove to be an ongoing struggle throughout the occupation period. Training intensified during the autumn and winter of 1940 and into 1941. The Totenkopf Division, stationed in various garrison areas across occupied France, implemented training programs that went far beyond conventional military instruction. Ideological education formed a crucial component. The men received indoctrination in racial ideology, the nature of the coming struggle against Bolshevism, and the moral framework that leadership intended them to adopt. This was not incidental to military training, but central to it. Political officers and SS leaders conducted lectures and study groups. The men were exposed to films, pamphlets, and speeches that reinforced the idea that they were not merely soldiers, but participants in a racial and civilizational struggle. For the veterans of the concentration camps in Poland, this represented a continuation of the indoctrination they had already absorbed. For the new recruits, it was an introduction to the worldview that their commanders believed would sustain them through the horrors they would eventually encounter. The expansion of the division's panzer capabilities represented another crucial transformation during this period. In France, the Totenkopf had operated primarily as an infantry and motorized formation with limited armor support. The regime's strategic plans for the Soviet Union demanded different capabilities. Beginning in 1940, the division received increasing allocations of tanks and armored vehicles. They acquired the 37mm anti-tank gun, and eventually began receiving Panzer tanks. Initially the light Panzer II model, with its 20mm gun, and then, as production ramped up, increasing numbers of the larger Panzer III. This mechanization fundamentally altered the division's tactical possibilities and its relationship to conventional military operations. The men who trained on these vehicles, many of them newly recruited, had to master complex machinery and develop proficiency in armored warfare. Veterans of the concentration camps and Polish campaign found themselves teaching young recruits the mechanics of tank operation, gunnery, and coordination between armor and infantry. The garrison duties in occupied France provided both opportunity and challenge. The Totenkopf Division, like other German military units, had to maintain order in the territories they occupied, supply themselves from the resources of the occupied country, and prevent resistance activity. The division's conduct during this occupation period demonstrated patterns that would intensify on the Eastern Front. They requisitioned supplies, taking what they needed from French civilian supplies and production. They conducted security operations against French resistance elements and potential subversives. Some elements of the division engaged in what might be termed conventional military occupation, controlling territory, maintaining order, establishing supply depots, and training areas. Other elements, particularly those with strong SS backgrounds, conducted operations that blurred the line between military security and outright repression. The occupation was not marked by the systematic massacres and deportations that would characterize the Eastern Front, but it established patterns of behavior and attitudes toward occupation that would become far more consequential when the division deployed eastward. The relationship between the Totenkopf Division and regular Wehrmacht units continued to be complicated and sometimes contentious. The Wehrmacht's officer corps, while broadly accommodating of SS formations, harbored reservations about SS ideology and SS claims of military superiority. The Totenkopf's integration into larger command structures meant that Theodor Eicke and his officers had to navigate relationships with army group commanders, corps commanders, and other regular army officers. These relationships were rarely simple. Eicke was fiercely protective of his division's independence and its ideological character. He resisted what he perceived as attempts by the Wehrmacht to dilute SS distinctiveness or subordinate SS interests to broader military objectives. The occupation period in France, with its relative stability and reduced operational tempo, provided an opportunity for these institutional relationships to develop. Regular army officers observed SS conduct and attitudes. SS officers gained experience working within larger military command structures. The mutual distrust and rivalry that characterized German military institutions became more clearly defined. The question of what came next was never in doubt to anyone in the Totenkopf Division by the winter of 1941. Hitler had ordered the preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union even before the French campaign ended. By the summer of 1940, planning for Operation Barbarossa was already underway at the highest levels of the Nazi state and military. The Totenkopf Division, through its officer corps and through intelligence channels, understood that Soviet territory would be their next destination. The ideological preparation for this campaign differed fundamentally from the preparation for Poland and France. This was not framed as a war against a foreign nation, or even against a hostile state. This was presented as a racial and civilizational struggle against Bolshevism, against an alien ideology, against peoples deemed racially inferior and historically backward. The indoctrination intensified with this understanding. The men were being prepared not merely for combat, but for a kind of warfare that transcended conventional military categories. The division's equipment and organization underwent significant modification during this preparation period. The Totenkopf was reorganized along lines that emphasized its role as a motorized and mechanized formation capable of rapid movement and sustained offensive operations. The Panzer and Panzer Grenadier elements were integrated into a command structure that could coordinate armor, mechanized infantry, and supporting elements. Artillery batteries were reorganized and expanded. The divisional staff grew to accommodate the larger force and the more complex organizational structure that mechanized warfare demanded. Signal companies were expanded to maintain communication across the more dispersed tactical formations. Supply and logistics elements were reorganized to support a larger force operating in more demanding terrain than France had required. By early 1941, the Totenkopf had transformed from a relatively compact force of elite guards into a full-strength mechanized division of roughly 16,000 to 18,000 men, equipped with multiple companies of tanks, expanded artillery, and the full administrative and logistical apparatus of a major military formation. The men themselves occupied a curious position in the occupied territories. They were young, mostly, the new recruits in their late teens and early 20s. They had been selected for the SS, which carried prestige and a sense of special status within German society. They were equipped with superior weapons and equipment compared to regular army formations. They received higher pay and better rations. They were told constantly that they were the elite of the German nation, the vanguard of a revolutionary transformation of Europe and the world. Yet they were also isolated, separated from civilian German society, subjected to intense indoctrination and training, and increasingly aware that they were being prepared for something far more significant than garrison duty in France. Some embraced the ideological vision they were being offered. Others complied because resistance was impossible, and because the material benefits and the sense of belonging to an elite group outweighed their reservations. The division, as a whole, was becoming more unified in its ideological orientation, more completely absorbed into the SS worldview, and more thoroughly prepared for the kind of warfare that the Eastern Front would demand. By the spring of 1941, the Totenkopf Division stood at the edge of transformation. The occupation of France had provided a crucial period of reconstitution and expansion. The new recruits had been partially integrated, though the process of creating a coherent ideological and operational unity from such disparate elements would remain incomplete. The division's capabilities had been significantly expanded, with new equipment and mechanized formations. The men had been exposed to intensified ideological indoctrination that framed the coming war as something fundamentally different from previous campaigns. Theodor Eicke had successfully defended his division's independence while integrating it into larger Wehrmacht command structures. The Totenkopf was no longer primarily a concentration camp guard unit or a specialized SS formation. It was a modern, mechanized division, larger, better equipped, and more fully integrated into Germany's military apparatus than it had been before. Yet it retained the distinctive character that Eicke and the SS had cultivated, an emphasis on ideological purity, unquestioning obedience to orders, and a worldview that saw the coming struggle in terms of racial and civilizational conflict. When the division crossed the Soviet frontier in June 1941, it would carry with it all of these accumulated developments: the brutality learned in concentration camps, the combat experience from Poland and France, the enlarged capabilities and mechanized formations, and the deepened ideological commitment. The transformation accomplished during the occupation of France had prepared the Totenkopf for the systematic criminality and grinding brutality that the Eastern Front would demand. In the spring of 1941, as German forces massed along the Soviet frontier, the Totenkopf Division received its orders. The unit, now reorganized into a military formation of over 6,000 men, would deploy eastward as part of Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb. Unlike the rapid conquest of France the previous year, this campaign carried an entirely different character. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not presented to the troops as a conventional military operation, but as an ideological war of annihilation. Theodor Eicke and his officers understood that the Eastern Front demanded something far more brutal than the combat they had experienced in the West. The men under their command, many of them drawn from concentration camp service, were already accustomed to viewing human life as expendable. Now, they would be told that this disposition was not merely acceptable, but necessary. On the 22nd of June 1941, German forces crossed into Soviet territory across a front stretching over 1,000 kilometers. The Totenkopf Division advanced with Army Group North toward the Baltic states, moving through Lithuania, Latvia, and toward Leningrad. The initial campaign was marked by spectacular tactical success. Soviet forces in the opening weeks appeared disorganized and unprepared for the scale and speed of the German assault. The Totenkopf Division, equipped with modern panzer and armored vehicles, drove forward at a pace that seemed to vindicate years of preparation. Within weeks, they had advanced over 300 kilometers into enemy territory. Yet beneath this surface of military efficiency lay the instruments of a different kind of warfare altogether. The racial ideology that had motivated the construction of concentration camps now extended itself across an entire conquered territory. The Nazi regime issued a series of directives in the weeks before the invasion that fundamentally altered the legal and moral framework of warfare. The Commissar Order instructed troops to execute Soviet political officers immediately upon capture. The Barbarossa Decree granted immunity to troops for crimes committed against Soviet civilians and prisoners. These were not aberrations or disciplinary failures waiting to happen. They were deliberate policies, issued from the highest levels of German command and communicated down through the chain of authority. For units like the Totenkopf Division, whose officers had spent years running concentration camps, these orders aligned perfectly with their existing operational culture. The nature of the combat itself reinforced this trajectory toward atrocity. Unlike France, where the Wehrmacht had faced organized military forces with established protocols of surrender, the Eastern Front presented circumstances that invited and encouraged mass killing. Soviet soldiers, desperately short of supplies and leadership in the opening months, often surrendered in vast numbers. German logistics could not accommodate the processing and maintenance of hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The Wehrmacht and SS faced a choice: maintain prisoners despite overwhelming supply difficulties, or kill them. For the Totenkopf Division and other SS formations, this choice was predetermined. The ideology of racial struggle that had been instilled in them during their concentration camp service provided a framework that rendered Soviet prisoners not as soldiers deserving protection, but as racial enemies deserving destruction. Starvation, execution, and exposure became systematic rather than incidental. The Totenkopf Division's advance through the Baltic states provides documented evidence of this escalation. In Lithuania and Latvia, the unit participated in operations that went far beyond military necessity. Einsatzgruppe A, a mobile killing unit of the SS, operated in the division's operational area. While the Totenkopf itself was primarily a combat division, rather than an extermination unit, the relationship between frontline troops and these killing squads was fluid. Soldiers from the division provided logistical support, cordoned off areas where executions occurred, and in some documented cases, participated directly in mass shootings. Local populations, including Jews, communists, and partisan sympathizers, as defined by German racial and political criteria, faced systematic murder. The division's commanding officers did not merely tolerate these activities, they facilitated them. Theodor Eicke himself ensured that his men understood their role in the broader ideological project of the Eastern Campaign. The speed of the Totenkopf Division's advance created a peculiar military situation. As they drove deep into Soviet territory, they often found themselves far ahead of supporting units, isolated and vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks. This vulnerability should have encouraged caution and restraint. Instead, it intensified the violence. Isolated units, surrounded by vast territories, declared to be enemy space, operating under ideological directives that dissolved legal restraint, committed atrocities with apparent impunity. Soviet prisoners were killed in groups rather than individually. Villages were burned, not primarily for military advantage, but because they contained what German ideology classified as racially undesirable populations. The frontier between combat and atrocity became meaningless. A Soviet civilian who might be a partisan, a Jewish resident who might harbor communist sympathies, or simply any inhabitant of conquered territory, became a target justified by the ideological framework within which the Totenkopf Division operated. The summer of 1941 was a season of transformation for the Totenkopf Division. The men who arrived at the Soviet frontier were soldiers, trained and equipped for conventional warfare. By autumn, after months of advancing through territories where the rules of civilized warfare had been explicitly suspended, they had become something else. The psychological and moral distance between guarding a concentration camp and participating in mass murder in occupied territory proved far smaller than conventional military ethics might suggest. The ideological education that Eicke had implemented during the division's years in garrison now revealed its full purpose. Men who might otherwise have recoiled from mass killing found themselves embedded in systems that made such killing routine. The orders came from above, the ideology justified the actions, and the isolation of the Eastern Front ensured that there would be no external accountability. The Soviet response to the German invasion was desperate and chaotic in the opening weeks, but by autumn, Soviet forces had begun to recover their organization. The Totenkopf Division, despite its initial successes, began to experience stiffer resistance. The supply lines, stretching over thousands of kilometers, became increasingly strained. The weather, which had seemed merely inconvenient in summer, became a looming threat as autumn turned to winter. The division was now engaged in a fundamentally different kind of warfare than anything it had experienced in France. The Western campaign had been a war of rapid movement and maneuver, concluded in weeks. The Eastern campaign was becoming a protracted struggle in a vast, hostile territory against an enemy that refused to acknowledge German military superiority. The speed of the initial advance had created an illusion of invulnerability. Reality was closing in. Yet even as the military situation deteriorated, the machinery of atrocity continued unabated. In fact, it accelerated. As Soviet forces rallied and German advances slowed, German command perceived a growing threat from partisan activity and political unreliability among Soviet populations. The response was intensified terror. The Totenkopf Division, moving through the Baltic territories toward Leningrad, was now operating in rear areas that were increasingly being cleared of Soviet soldiers, but not of civilians. The distinction between frontline combat and occupation operations blurred further. Villages that might harbor partisans were destroyed. Entire populations were relocated or eliminated. The division provided troops for these operations, and its officers ensured that the men understood them not as regrettable necessities, but as essential components of the ideological struggle that had been the true purpose of the war all along. The ideological framework that distinguished the Eastern Front from earlier campaigns became explicit in the orders and communications issued within the Totenkopf Division during these months. Theodor Eicke issued directives emphasizing that Soviet civilians were not protected by conventional laws of war. The concept of collective responsibility was introduced. If partisans operated in a village, the entire village bore responsibility and should be destroyed. These were not the temporary overexcitements of frontline troops in the chaos of combat. They were deliberate policies, communicated in writing, enforced through the chain of command. Officers who objected were replaced. Soldiers who hesitated were pushed forward by their comrades and commanders. The machinery of the division, originally constructed to run concentration camps, had been scaled up and extended across conquered territory. The number of victims was orders of magnitude larger, but the underlying logic remained identical. By the autumn of 1941, as the Totenkopf Division's supply situation became critical and the first Russian winter approached, a fundamental realization had taken hold. The victory that had seemed assured in June was not coming. The Soviet Union would not collapse in a campaign of weeks. Instead, German forces were settling into a prolonged war of attrition in hostile territory against an enemy that seemed to generate new armies faster than German forces could destroy them. The Totenkopf Division, blooded and hardened through months of combat and atrocities, was facing not triumph, but survival. The ideological crusade that had seemed so comprehensible in June was becoming a grim struggle for existence. Yet the men of the Totenkopf had been shaped by that crusade. They had crossed a moral line from which there was no return. The ideology of annihilation that had seemed so clear in the opening months would now become even more desperate and brutal as the war in the East entered its second year. The transformation of the Totenkopf Division during these opening months of Barbarossa reveals the mechanics through which ordinary military organizations can become instruments of systematic atrocity. The division did not become a killing unit overnight. It did not abandon military discipline or professionalism. Instead, the existing structure of the organization, the established hierarchy, and the men's prior experience in concentration camp service provided a framework within which ideology could be operationalized. Orders from above were obeyed. Moral objections were suppressed or never arose. The vastness of the territory, the desperate military situation, and the explicit suspension of legal restraint created circumstances in which horror became normalized. The Totenkopf Division's experience in the opening phase of the Eastern Campaign demonstrates that the Holocaust and other atrocities perpetrated by Nazi Germany were not the work of a tiny minority of fanatics, but the product of ordinary military organizations operating within an ideological system that had dismantled the restraints that normally govern warfare and human conduct. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa commenced across a frontier that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The Totenkopf Division, under the command of Theodor Eicke, stood ready along the eastern border of German-occupied Lithuania, positioned as part of Army Group North. Unlike the rapid mechanized campaigns of France and the Low Countries, the Eastern Front represented something fundamentally different, a war of ideological annihilation, where conventional military distinctions between combatant and civilian would dissolve into systematic destruction. The orders filtering down from Berlin were explicit in their intent. This was not merely a military campaign, but the enactment of racial struggle, a collision between what Nazi ideology defined as civilization and barbarism. For the Totenkopf Division, many of whose men had spent years indoctrinating concentration camp prisoners into submission, The transition to this new form of warfare came almost naturally. The division would advance into Russia not as conventional soldiers enforcing military law, but as ideological warriors, authorized to wage war against an entire population deemed racially and politically inferior. The initial advance proved swift and devastating. As the Totenkopf Division pushed forward through Lithuania and into Latvia during the opening weeks of the campaign, Soviet resistance crumbled before the overwhelming German onslaught. Mechanized columns moved rapidly northward, outpacing supply lines and shattering Soviet formations caught in the opening German offensives. The division's soldiers, many of them hardened by years of service in the concentration camp system, demonstrated exceptional ferocity in these early engagements. Soviet prisoners captured in the opening weeks numbered in the tens of thousands across Army Group North sector, and the Totenkopf Division took its share. Yet what distinguished the division's behavior from that of regular Wehrmacht units was not merely the scale of violence, but its systematic character. Instructions filtered through divisional channels that effectively suspended conventional military discipline regarding the treatment of enemy soldiers and civilians. The division's officers, steeped in SS ideology and responsive to Ike's unwavering emphasis on ideological purity, created an environment in which brutality was not merely tolerated, but expected as a mark of commitment to the cause. The summer months of 1941 saw the Totenkopf Division engaged in relentless combat as German forces drove deep into Soviet territory. Supply lines stretched thin across the vast distances of the Russian interior, and the division's men endured constant pressure from Soviet counterattacks, harassing operations, and the exhaustion of ceaseless advance. Casualty figures mounted steadily as Soviet forces, despite suffering catastrophic losses in the opening phase, continued to resist and reorganize. The division's panzer companies suffered significant attrition, and infantry strength declined as wounded men were evacuated or killed, and casualty rates exceeded replacement capacity. By late summer, the Totenkopf Division had lost a substantial portion of its combat strength, yet the pace of operations did not diminish. Ike drove his men relentlessly, demanding offensive action and rapid advances, regardless of the mounting toll. The combination of combat losses, disease, and exposure created an environment of desperation, where normal military protocols governing the treatment of prisoners and civilians began to fragment entirely. Behind the front lines, in the rear areas secured by advancing German forces, a different kind of campaign unfolded. The Totenkopf Division, like other SS formations, assumed responsibility for security operations in occupied Soviet territories. These operations involved the identification and elimination of perceived enemies of the Nazi state, Communist Party functionaries, Soviet military officers, Jewish populations, and anyone deemed a threat to German security. The division's soldiers, many of them former concentration camp guards, accustomed to the casual exercise of power over defenseless populations, adapted readily to these tasks. Captured Soviet commissars, the political officers assigned to Red Army units, were summarily executed in accordance with the Commissar Order, a directive that authorized the immediate killing of Soviet political officers rather than their incorporation into the conventional prisoner of war system. These killings were not spontaneous acts of combat brutality, but systematic executions carried out under orders and often meticulously documented by divisional records. Jewish communities in the territories the division occupied faced particular peril. Mobile killing units, including detachments from the Totenkopf Division, participated in or facilitated massacres of Jewish civilians in the Baltic states and Western Soviet Union. The volume of atrocities expanded as German forces moved deeper into Soviet territory, and as the psychological effects of intense combat, combined with ideological indoctrination, to erode whatever restraint existed among the division's soldiers. The massacre at Luga, in the vicinity of Leningrad, exemplified the pattern of escalating violence that characterized the Totenkopf Division's campaign. Soviet prisoners of war, captured in the fighting around this key location, numbered in the thousands. The German military's supply system, already strained by the vast distances involved and the scale of operations, proved incapable of feeding and housing such numbers of captives. Divisional commanders received directives from higher headquarters that effectively authorized the starvation of Soviet prisoners. Vast numbers of captured Soviet soldiers were held in open camps with minimal food rations, no medical care, and no shelter from the elements. Many perished from disease, exposure, and malnutrition. Others were killed deliberately by guards who viewed them as expendable. Estimates suggest that more than 2 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity, and the Totenkopf Division bore direct responsibility for significant numbers of these deaths. The division's records, preserved through the war and later examined during the post-war investigations, documented the presence of these camps and the division's administrative role in their operation, though the full scale of atrocities was only comprehensively understood in the post-war period. The psychological impact of the Eastern Front campaign on the division's soldiers manifested in visible transformations. Young men who had entered the division with a mix of ideological conviction and conventional military ambition underwent a brutalizing transformation. The constant exposure to violence, the dehumanizing propaganda that preceded and accompanied operations, and the effective authorization to commit atrocities created a moral framework fundamentally distinct from that of conventional military service. Letters and diaries from divisional soldiers, captured and preserved after the war, reveal a progression from initial shock at the scale of violence to gradual acceptance and even enthusiasm for criminal acts. Some soldiers expressed enthusiasm for the ideological crusade they believed they were waging. Others rationalized the violence through the lens of military necessity or racial ideology. Still others appeared traumatized by what they witnessed and perpetrated, yet continued to participate because refusal appeared impossible within the rigid hierarchy of SS command. The division's command structure, through Eicker's leadership and that of subordinate commanders, actively cultivated this brutalization through constant indoctrination, the celebration of aggressive action, and the punishment of any manifestation of reluctance or moral hesitation. Forced labor and population displacement became integral to the division's operations as 1941 progressed. Civilians in occupied territories were subjected to forced conscription into labor gangs, which constructed fortifications, maintained roads, and performed other work in support of German military operations. The division's men served as overseers and guards for these labor operations. Conditions were uniformly brutal, food rations were minimal, and medical care was non-existent. Civilians who fell ill or became unable to work faced summary execution. Women and children were not spared from these operations. The division's records, combined with post-war testimony from survivors, document systematic violence against the civilian population in the rear areas the division controlled. Villages were razed in retaliation for partisan activity or suspected sympathy with Soviet forces. Civilians were executed as collective punishment for actions committed by partisan groups. The division's soldiers looted villages for supplies, requisitioned whatever food stores existed for the army, and left the civilian population facing starvation through the approaching winter months. The autumnal rains of 1941 transformed the Eastern Front into a nightmare of mud and chaos. The roads, barely adequate for peacetime traffic, became impassable quagmires. Vehicles became immobilized, and supply convoys moved at a crawl, if they moved at all. The division's panzer companies found their mobility severely constrained. Infantry units bogged down in the mud found themselves struggling to maintain formation and momentum. Soviet forces adapted to the terrain and conditions through generations of warfare across the Russian steppes, adapted more successfully than the German invaders. The Totenkopf Division, like other German formations, found its advance slowing dramatically as autumn transitioned to the approaching winter. Casualty rates continued to climb. Wounded men could not be evacuated efficiently, and the division's medical resources, stretched thin, struggled to treat the mounting number of casualties. The ideological fervor that had sustained operations through the summer months faced its first genuine test, as the grim realities of Russian warfare, the vast distances, the inexhaustible reserves of Soviet manpower, and the relentless pace of operations began to impose themselves on German planning and execution. Theodor Eicke, commanding the Totenkopf Division throughout this period, embodied the peculiar synthesis of SS ideology and military ambition that defined the unit's character. Eicke's leadership style emphasized relentless aggression, absolute obedience to his directives, and unwavering commitment to Nazi racial ideology. He visited frontline positions regularly, demanding offensive action and aggressive pursuit of Soviet forces. Yet he also demonstrated concern for divisional casualties and sought to maintain unit cohesion under extraordinary stress. Eicke's communications with higher headquarters reveal a commander increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as constraints on his freedom of action, and resentful of Wehrmacht officers, whom he viewed as insufficiently committed to ideological objectives. Eicke cultivated intense loyalty within the division through a combination of shared ideological commitment and military professionalism. The division's officers and non-commissioned officers, many of whom had served under Eicke in the concentration camp system, viewed him as embodying the ideals they believed themselves to represent. This loyalty created a closed command culture resistant to external oversight or criticism, facilitating the escalation of atrocities by shielding the division from broader military scrutiny. Soviet resistance stiffened as autumn transitioned toward winter. The Red Army, despite catastrophic losses in the opening phase of the campaign, continued to mobilize reserves and conduct counterattacks. The Totenkopf Division found itself engaged in increasingly bitter fighting against well-organized Soviet formations that no longer suffered from the disorganization and panic of the opening weeks. Tank versus tank engagements became more frequent and more costly. Infantry assaults faced increasingly effective Soviet defensive positions. The division's losses in armor began to accelerate beyond replacement capacity. The illusion of rapid, decisive victory, which had sustained German strategy through the opening months of the campaign, began to crumble as the scale and depth of Soviet resistance became apparent. Eicke's division had suffered approximately 8,000 casualties by late autumn, representing a significant portion of its initial strength. Yet the division's combat capability, though degraded, remained formidable. The combination of armored vehicles, trained personnel, and aggressive leadership kept the Totenkopf Division among the more effective German formations on the Eastern Front, despite the mounting human cost. The winter encampment of 1941 to 1942 approached with dread certainty. The Totenkopf Division, like all German formations positioned in Russia, faced the prospect of winter warfare without adequate cold weather clothing or supplies. The division's administrative personnel, aware of the catastrophe approaching, filed reports requesting additional winter equipment, extra food rations, and reinforcements to bring the division back to authorized strength. Higher headquarters could not meet these requests. Germany simply lacked the industrial capacity to equip, feed, and transport the enormous army it had committed to the Russian campaign. The Totenkopf Division, despite its elite status within the SS hierarchy, shared equally in the shortage. Plans were drawn for rotating troops to the rear for limited periods of rest, though these plans could rarely be executed due to the constant operational pressure. The men dug defensive positions and huddled in what shelter could be improvised against the approaching cold. The cycle of atrocity and violence against the civilian population intensified during the winter months, as the division's soldiers, desperate for supplies and warmth, became increasingly predatory toward the surrounding population. Requisitions became robberies. Shelter-seeking became occupation of civilian dwellings. The line between military necessity and criminal brutality dissolved entirely. The year 1941 closed with the Totenkopf Division, positioned in defensive posture across a broad sector of Army Group North's line. The grand vision of rapid victory through overwhelming mechanized assault had been superseded by the grim reality of sustained warfare against an enemy that refused to collapse despite suffering staggering losses. The division's men had experienced their first full year of combat on the Eastern Front. They had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, engaged Soviet forces in hundreds of engagements, and participated in the systematic destruction of the Soviet military capabilities in the Baltic region. They had also participated in systematic atrocities against Soviet prisoners of war, Soviet civilians, and Jewish populations. The combination of combat experience, ideological indoctrination, and explicit authorization for brutal behavior had transformed the Totenkopf Division into an instrument of both military aggression and systematic criminality. The division's records, captured at the end of the war and subsequently examined by international military tribunals, documented the division's direct involvement in war crimes. By the winter of 1941 to 1942, the Totenkopf Division had established a pattern of behavior that would persist through the remainder of the war. Fierce combat capability, coupled with systematic brutality toward prisoners and civilians. The first phase of the Eastern Front campaign had proven catastrophically costly for Germany and its allies. For the Totenkopf Division, it represented a descent into criminality from which there would be no return. The year 1941 had arrived with the promise of swift victory. The German High Command calculated that the Soviet Union would collapse within 4 to 6 months, perhaps less. The Totenkopf Division, hardened by combat in Poland and France, seemed positioned to fulfill that prophecy. By September, they had advanced deeper into Soviet territory than anyone in Berlin had dared to imagine just 3 months prior. The division's soldiers moved through the Baltic states and into Russia proper, driven by momentum, by ideological fervor, and by the conviction that they were witnessing the final chapter of their enemy's existence. But as autumn turned to winter, that certainty began to fracture. The first hints came in late October, when the supply trains started arriving incomplete. By November, the cold had arrived with a ferocity that no amount of ideological conviction could withstand. The winter of 1941 to 1942 did not announce itself with mercy. Temperatures plummeted to levels that German soldiers, trained for European combat, had never truly experienced. The thermometer fell past -20 degrees Celsius, then further still, sometimes dropping below -30. Snow accumulated across the Russian steppes in depths that swallowed vehicles and buried fortifications. The landscape, which had seemed manageable during the autumn advance, transformed into something altogether hostile and indifferent to human ambition. The Totenkopf Division found itself holding defensive positions across a front stretching hundreds of kilometers, with insufficient men to adequately garrison them, and with supply lines that had begun to collapse under the weight of distance and Soviet interdiction. What had been a war of movement had become a war of attrition in conditions that were themselves a more implacable enemy than any Soviet army. The logistics crisis was not mysterious or unexpected by every observer. Some Wehrmacht officers had warned as early as summer that the supply structure would break down if the campaign did not conclude by autumn. Those warnings went largely unheeded in the higher echelons of German command, driven by ideological optimism and a profound underestimation of Soviet reserves. The Totenkopf Division, like all German units on the Eastern Front, experienced the cascade of failure that followed. Ammunition grew scarce before food did. Fuel for vehicles became a precious commodity to be guarded and rationed. Winter clothing, which should have been manufactured and distributed months in advance, arrived in inadequate quantities or not at all. Many soldiers faced the Russian winter in uniform, designed for temperate zones, wrapped in whatever additional layers they could improvise from captured Soviet equipment or materials scavenged from the harsh landscape around them. The gap between what headquarters promised and what actually arrived at the front lines grew into a chasm. Casualties mounted with relentless arithmetic. Combat losses were significant, surely, but they were eclipsed by what the medical records tersely classified as losses to cold. Frostbite became endemic. Soldiers' fingers and toes blackened and died while they remained alive, a slow amputation by freezing. Trench foot ravaged those who could not keep their feet dry in the perpetually frozen mud and snow. Pneumonia and bronchitis spread through the ranks. The Totenkopf Division, which had arrived in Russia as a formidable fighting force, numbering thousands of combat troops, began to shrink, not through glorious combat, but through the slow grinding away of human bodies pushed beyond their physiological limits. By January 1942, entire companies were reduced to platoon strength. Platoons functioned as squads. The division's capacity to conduct offensive operations evaporated like breath in the freezing air. What remained was merely the machinery of defensive survival, consuming soldiers faster than replacements could possibly arrive. The standard organizational response to this crisis would have been to rotate units to rear areas, to allow rest and recovery, to distribute the burden more equitably across multiple divisions. The German military situation did not permit this luxury. The front had to be held. Soviet pressure was constant, and in places intensifying. The Totenkopf Division, like other SS formations in the same sector, received orders to maintain their positions regardless of the cost. This created a vicious cycle. Men weakened by cold, hunger, and exhaustion fought with diminished effectiveness. Positions that should have been impregnable to assault became vulnerable. The division had to feed more soldiers into defensive battles to prevent breakthroughs, which accelerated the consumption of their remaining strength. By early 1942, the division was operating far below its authorized strength. Yet command expectations for defensive performance had not diminished proportionally. The psychological toll operated on a different register than the physical casualties. The soldiers of the Totenkopf Division had been selected and trained for ideological fervor. Theodor Eicke had built the unit around absolute obedience and racial consciousness. Yet no amount of ideological conviction prevented frostbite or hunger. Morale, which had been high during the rapid advance, began to erode. Men who had been convinced of their superiority as warriors and as members of an ideologically pure formation found themselves barely able to maintain basic functions of survival. Letters that survived the war reveal a growing despair, a creeping understanding that the war might not end in the swift victory that had been promised. Some soldiers clung to ideology as a shield against despair, repeating the catchphrases and slogans that had been drilled into them. Others sank into a kind of fatalistic numbness, moving mechanically from one day to the next. The breakdown of conventional military discipline was not dramatic or organized. It was the slow, almost invisible dissolution that occurs when soldiers cease to believe that their sacrifice serves any meaningful purpose. Command structures adapted to the crisis through mechanisms that were simultaneously logical and corrosive. As casualty rates among junior officers and non-commissioned officers climbed, replacements had to come from somewhere. The Totenkopf Division, like the broader German military, began to promote soldiers more rapidly, often without adequate training for their new responsibilities. Unit cohesion had previously depended on shared experience and a common understanding of the unit's mission and identity. As turnover accelerated, that cohesion became harder to maintain. New arrivals, many of them conscripts from outside the original SS cadre, lacked the ideological indoctrination that had characterized the pre-war formations. They were soldiers, and they were cold, and they were hungry, and they wanted to survive. The old guard of the Totenkopf, the men who had been concentration camp guards and who had volunteered for this formation, found themselves commanding men who did not necessarily share their ideological framework. This created friction and made the unit less cohesive as an organization, even as that organization became increasingly essential to German defensive operations. The winter also created a brutal environment for the enforcement of discipline and order. In more stable operational situations, the Totenkopf Division had maintained harsh discipline through ideological appeals and the threat of punishment. In the desperate circumstances of the Russian winter, these mechanisms proved insufficient. Men who were exhausted and freezing and facing death from cold found themselves unable or unwilling to comply with orders that seemed arbitrary or suicidal. The response from command was often to double down on punishment and ideological rhetoric, creating a cycle where coercion and terror were substituted for the motivated obedience that had previously characterized the unit. Some soldiers deserted, though desertion rates within the Totenkopf remained lower than in some Wehrmacht formations, perhaps because those who remained believed that escape from the unit was more likely to result in execution by their own comrades than by Soviet forces. Others were executed for breaches of discipline, examples made to encourage compliance among the remaining troops. The division began to function more like a punishment formation sustained by terror than a military unit sustained by morale and shared purpose. The grinding defensive operations that characterized the 1941 to 1942 winter produced few dramatic moments, but countless small moments of horror. The Totenkopf Division was rotated through various defensive sectors across the Eastern Front, sometimes holding positions near Leningrad, sometimes further south near Kharkov. In each location, the pattern was similar: frozen ground that had to be broken with explosives to create any kind of defensive trench or fortification. Positions that had to be held against Soviet assaults that came in the darkness and the snow, sometimes suicidally costly for the attackers, sometimes achieving breakthrough that had to be desperately contained. Patrols that moved through the frozen night searching for Soviet infiltrators or attempting to gather intelligence about enemy dispositions. Constant hunger, constant cold, constant awareness that the human body was simply not designed to function in such conditions for extended periods. Soldiers developed strategies for survival that had nothing to do with military training. They learned to move in ways that conserved heat. They hoarded food with fierce possessiveness. They understood, without being told, that the unit's organizational collapse was proceeding, and that individual survival might depend more on immediate comrades and personal cunning than on any broader military plan. The relationship between the Totenkopf Division and the local Soviet population in occupied territory took on darker dimensions during this winter of survival. As German supply lines failed and soldiers became increasingly desperate, requisition of local food stocks and resources became more systematic and more ruthless. The division had already been involved in crimes against Soviet civilians and prisoners of war during the advance phase of the campaign. The winter transformed casual brutality into systematic desperation. Villages in the division's rear area were stripped of whatever food remained. Civilians who resisted or who were suspected of supporting partisan activity faced execution. Soviet prisoners of war, whom the division held in inadequate camps, died in vast numbers from cold and starvation, casualties that command recorded with bureaucratic indifference. The ideological framework that justified such actions remained in place and perhaps deepened. The war of racial annihilation that had been the theoretical justification for the invasion became, for some soldiers, the rationale for survival itself. If the enemy was subhuman and the war was absolute, then any measures necessary to survive could be justified. By February and March of 1942, the worst of the winter was ending, but the Totenkopf Division emerged from it transformed. The unit that had driven northward in triumph 6 months earlier was depleted and exhausted. Replacements were arriving, young men conscripted into the Waffen-SS divisions to maintain German manpower. These men were soldiers, but they were not the ideologically pure formations of the pre-war SS. They were soldiers fighting for survival and for Germany, but without the fervent belief in their own superiority that had once characterized the original Totenkopf cadre. The division would recover its strength and resume offensive operations. Theodor Eicke would oversee this recovery with his characteristic determination and ruthlessness. The Totenkopf would continue to fight with ferocity and effectiveness, but something essential had changed in the winter. The certainty of victory had given way to a grimmer understanding that the war would be long, costly, and perhaps not winnable. The soldiers of the Totenkopf Division had survived the winter, but the winter had also survived in them, hardening some and breaking others, creating an organization held together less by ideology and shared purpose than by fear, exhaustion, and the simple human desire to endure until tomorrow. Theodor Eicke was not a man who expected to die the way he did. For more than a decade, he had shaped the Totenkopf organization through sheer force of will, transforming scattered paramilitary guards into what he believed was the vanguard of a racial revolution. He had survived the chaos of the early Nazi period, the consolidation of SS power, the expansion of the concentration camp apparatus, and now the grinding horror of the Eastern Front. He had been decorated, promoted, and granted near absolute authority over his division. Yet, on the 16th of February in 1943, as his Feisler Storch reconnaissance aircraft banked low over the frozen landscape near Kharkov, a burst of Soviet anti-aircraft fire shredded the fuselage. The small plane spiraled earthward. Theodor Eicke, aged 58 years old, was dead before the wreckage struck the ice-covered ground below. His death came at a moment when the Eastern Front had begun its catastrophic collapse. The great German advance that had promised to destroy Bolshevism and conquer living space had stalled, shattered, and then reversed itself in the ruins of Stalingrad. The Totenkopf Division, which had played its own brutal role in that advance, was reeling from 18 months of continuous combat. The men who had once guarded the concentration camps had learned to fear winter as much as they feared the inexhaustible Soviet enemy. They had bled at Leningrad, fought across the steppes, endured the suffocating despair of the Russian winter, and watched the promises of ideological victory fade into the grey reality of an endless, losing war. Eicke's death in combat added a certain bitter poetry to the circumstances. The man who had built the Totenkopf through terror and discipline would not see the destruction he had helped to bring upon his own creation. The circumstances of the death itself remained somewhat unclear for weeks. Official accounts stated that Eike's aircraft had been hit by ground fire while flying on a reconnaissance mission. The pilot and Eike's adjutant were also killed. There were suggestions that Eike might have been deliberately shot down by Soviet fighters, though the documentary evidence points toward anti-aircraft fire as the cause. What mattered more than the mechanical details was the symbolic weight. Eike had spent the war flying around the Eastern Front, observing his division in combat, conferring with higher SS and Wehrmacht commanders, positioning himself as both the tactical leader of his unit and a rising figure within the SS hierarchy. His death in a low-flying aircraft over enemy territory had the quality of a warrior's end, and the Nazi propaganda apparatus would eventually use it as such. Yet there was also an element of the arbitrary and mundane about it. He had died not in a great battle, but in a small aircraft, far from the main lines of combat, one of thousands of officers killed in the vast attrition of the Eastern Front. Within the Totenkopf Division, news of Eike's death created a vacuum, both literal and psychological. He had been the sole consistent authority figure in the unit since its founding under his direction at Dachau a decade earlier. He was not universally loved. His brutal discipline and ideological fanaticism had made him figures of fear and resentment among many soldiers, but he was recognized as the embodiment of the division's identity. But every man in the unit knew that the Totenkopf's ferocity, its reputation for ruthlessness, its distinct character within the Wehrmacht hierarchy, all stemmed from Eike's vision and his iron control. He had elevated men through patronage, broken careers through public humiliation, and created a system where ideology and military competence were theoretically inseparable. The division had been Theodor Eike in a very real sense. Without him, there was uncertainty about its future direction and its meaning within the broader context of Nazi power. The succession of command passed to Max Simon, a senior Totenkopf officer who had proven his competence in combat. Simon was a different type of leader than Eike. Where Eike had been volatile, ideologically fervent, and prone to dramatic gestures, Simon was more measured and professional in his approach. He had been with the division since its earliest days and understood its internal dynamics and the expectations placed upon SS formations. However, Simon faced an impossible situation. The material circumstances that had empowered Eike, the forward momentum of German military power, the resources to expand and consolidate, the apparent plausibility of ultimate victory, had fundamentally changed by early 1943. The division was no longer an organization that could be held together purely by charismatic leadership and ideological fervor. It was a battered formation that had lost nearly 40% of its combat strength and faced an enemy that grew stronger with every passing month. The transition of command also reflected broader changes within SS leadership. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer of the entire SS apparatus, had increasingly positioned the Waffen-SS divisions as elite combat formations within the Wehrmacht structure, even as they maintained a separate chain of command and retained their ideological distinctiveness. Eike had been a bridge figure between the older guard tradition of the SS and the modern military role of the armed SS divisions. His death created an opportunity for SS leadership to assert more direct control over the Totenkopf organization and to shape its direction according to broader strategic objectives. Simon, while competent and loyal, was more amenable to this kind of direction from above than Eike had been. Eike had always insisted on the independence and authority of his division. Simon would prove more willing to work within the evolving SS command structure though this required accepting less autonomy for his unit. The division's role on the Eastern Front did not pause for the transition of command. In March 1943, barely a month after Eicke's death, the Totenkopf Division participated in the German counteroffensive around Kharkov, which temporarily stabilized the front and inflicted heavy losses on Soviet forces. This combat operation occurred under Max Simon's command and demonstrated that the division retained considerable combat capability despite its losses and the shock of losing its founder. The Kharkov counteroffensive provided Simon with an opportunity to establish his own authority within the division and to demonstrate to higher command that the Totenkopf remained an effective fighting force. It also allowed him to begin reshaping the division's culture and operations, according to his own vision. Though he maintained many of Eicke's essential organizational principles and ideological emphases. However, the long-term trajectory could not be altered by even a successful counteroffensive. The fundamental problem was that Germany had lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The Soviets had learned to coordinate their forces more effectively, to mass their armor and artillery with devastating effect, and to maintain the offensive even when their offensives were temporarily repulsed. The Totenkopf Division, like every other German formation, was caught in a grinding attritional struggle that it could not hope to win. Replacement soldiers were sent forward, but they lacked the training and experience of the men they replaced. Equipment was repaired, and some new vehicles were provided, but the division could not keep pace with Soviet rearmament. Casualties mounted with every engagement. By late 1943, the Totenkopf Division's actual combat strength had become a fraction of its authorized establishment. The succession also raised uncomfortable questions about the division's purpose and identity that would persist through the remainder of the war. Under Eicke, the Totenkopf had been a distinct ideological project, a military expression of SS racial and revolutionary philosophy. The men had been trained in isolation from the Wehrmacht, indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, and taught to see themselves as the elite vanguard of the new order. The concentration camp background of the unit's original cadre meant that many senior officers had direct experience with the systematized brutality that undergirded Nazi racial policy. This had shaped the division's conduct in combat and in occupied territories, distinguishing it even among Waffen-SS formations. Max Simon was not a man with Eicke's deep roots in the concentration camp system. His conception of the Totenkopf as a military unit was more conventional, more focused on tactical effectiveness within the Wehrmacht framework. This represented a subtle but significant shift in the division's character and orientation. The personnel changes that followed Eicke's death extended beyond the commander position. Several of Eicke's closest associates and subordinates were also either killed in combat or promoted to other positions within the SS hierarchy during 1943. This created opportunities for younger officers to advance and brought fresh perspectives to the division's leadership structure. However, it also meant that institutional memory and ideological continuity were disrupted. The newer generation of officers had been shaped by the war itself, rather than by the pre-war consolidation of Nazi power and the construction of the concentration camp system. They were professionals in a way that Eicke, for all his military effectiveness, had never been. This generational transition reflected the broader militarization of the Waffen-SS and the gradual dilution of its explicitly ideological character, though this process would not be completed until the final months of the war. The impact of Eicke's death on the division's morale was complex and not entirely measurable. Propaganda emphasized the heroic nature of his death and encouraged soldiers to view his sacrifice as an inspiration to continue fighting. However, among the men themselves, his passing removed a figure whose force of personality had been central to the division's identity. Some soldiers felt a sense of liberation. Eicke's discipline had been severe and his expectations relentless. Others felt a sense of loss, a recognition that something distinctive and powerful within the organization had ended. The Totenkopf Division would continue to function as a military formation, and under Max Seemann, it would achieve some notable tactical successes. However, it would never again possess the coherence and clarity of purpose that had characterized it under Theodor Eicke. The division's remaining years would be marked by increasing desperation, mounting losses, and an endless retreat across the Eastern Front, and eventually back toward the Reich itself. The succession from Theodor Eicke to Max Seemann marked a crucial turning point in the Totenkopf Division's history, even if it was not immediately apparent as such. Eicke's death removed the originating figure whose will and vision had shaped the unit from its earliest days. Max Seemann was a capable officer who would lead the division through some of its most brutal engagements and preserve its fighting effectiveness longer than anyone would have predicted possible, given the circumstances. However, the division that Seemann led was no longer quite the formation that Eicke had built. It was still ideologically indoctrinated, still dedicated to the Nazi cause, still capable of ferocity in combat, but it was now more firmly integrated into the Wehrmacht hierarchy, more oriented toward conventional military objectives, and less of an explicitly ideological experiment. The Totenkopf would serve to the end, in Hungary, in the Ardennes, in the final desperate defensive operations of the Reichenkampf, but it would serve within parameters increasingly set by the broader German military hierarchy, rather than by the autonomous vision of its founder. Theodor Eicke's legacy would be defined not by the end of his life, but by the organization he left behind. The Totenkopf Division, that continued after his death, would be held responsible, in the post-war period, for numerous documented atrocities and war crimes committed both before and during the war. Eicke himself would be implicated in the development of concentration camp protocols and the training of men specifically for brutality. His death in combat against the Soviet Union meant that he would avoid capture and trial by the Allies. Max Seemann and other surviving officers would face interrogation and legal proceedings. The question of institutional responsibility would extend across the entire leadership hierarchy of the division. Yet in the immediate aftermath of Eicke's death in February 1943, the Totenkopf Division was still a functioning military organization, fighting on the front lines. The future that would eventually lead to the Nuremberg trials and the detailed historical examination of the SS divisions was still hidden in the chaos of the Eastern Front. For now, there was only the terrible present of combat, survival, and the knowledge that whatever lay ahead, the war was moving in only one direction, toward catastrophe. In the winter of 1942 and into the early months of 1943, the Eastern Front had become a graveyard of German ambitions. The grand offensives that had promised swift victory had stalled, faltered, and in many cases collapsed entirely. Stalingrad had fallen in February, a catastrophic defeat that rippled through the German high command and shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. The Totenkopf Division, having survived the merciless Russian winter through desperate measures and ideological cohesion, found itself reconstituting its strength in preparation for what German commanders hoped would be a decisive counteroffensive. The Soviet forces, buoyed by their triumph at Stalingrad, pressed westward with relentless momentum, seeking to exploit German weakness and capture the industrial city of Kharkov, which lay in the path of their advance. Command decisions made in distant headquarters would soon place the Totenkopf directly in the path of this Soviet tide, testing the division's resilience in ways that would either restore German confidence or hasten its final collapse. The strategic situation in southern Russia in early 1943 presented a deceptive opportunity to German military planners. The Soviet winter offensives, though powerful, had stretched supply lines thin across the frozen landscape. Soviet forces had advanced rapidly westward, creating a salient, a bulge in the front line that extended dangerously far from their main supply bases. German commanders, particularly Army Group South under Erich von Manstein, saw in this salient a vulnerability that could be exploited. The plan, codenamed Operation Polkovodets Kutuzov by the Soviets, and known to historians as the Battle of Kharkov, would involve German forces attacking from north and south simultaneously to encircle and destroy Soviet forces that had advanced too far. The Totenkopf Division, now operating as part of the 4th Panzer Army under Colonel General Hermann Hoth, received orders to advance northward toward Kharkov, supporting the broader German strategy of encirclement and annihilation. By March 1943, the Totenkopf Division had been reorganized and partially rearmed following its ordeal in the Russian winter. The unit remained severely under strength compared to its authorized establishment, with casualties replaced by hastily trained recruits and hardened veterans from the concentration camp guard service. The division had acquired new panzer tanks and assault guns, equipment that transformed it into a more mechanized formation than it had been before. Though still far from the fully armored divisions of the Wehrmacht's elite Panzer Corps, leadership within the division had stabilized under commanders who understood both conventional military tactics and the ideological imperatives that the Nazi regime demanded. The men of the Totenkopf, despite their exhaustion and depleted numbers, retained a fierce pride in their unit and a determination to prove themselves once again on the battlefield. As winter receded and the spring thaw began to soften the frozen earth, the division prepared to advance into what would become one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune on the Eastern Front. The Soviet forces occupying the Kharkov salient in early March were themselves in a precarious position, though they possessed superior numbers and momentum. General Nikolai Vatutin commanded the Soviet forces in the region, and Soviet intelligence had warned of potential German counteroffensives. Yet the Red Army High Command believed their own strength sufficient to resist any German thrust. The Soviets launched their own offensive operations against German positions, even as German forces were preparing to strike, creating a brutal collision between two armies, both convinced of their ability to defeat the other. The Totenkopf Division, advancing from the south, encountered Soviet infantry, armor, and determined defensive positions that had been prepared to resist German counterattacks. The fighting was savage and unrelenting, characteristic of warfare on the Eastern Front, where neither side offered quarter, and surrender was often not an option for those captured. Yet the German counteroffensive, built around superior tactics and the initiative that came from choosing the time and place of engagement, began to show results that surprised even confident Soviet commanders. As the Totenkopf Division drove northward through the frozen and muddy landscape toward Kharkov, the unit engaged in the kind of fluid, rapid mechanized warfare that showcased German tactical superiority at its height. The division's panzer elements, coordinated with infantry transported in trucks and half-tracked vehicles, executed flanking movements and exploitation tactics that overwhelmed isolated Soviet formations. Soviet commanders found themselves unable to coordinate a coherent defense as German mechanized columns bypassed strongpoints and drove deep into their formations. The Totenkopf's men, operating in small combined arms teams, demonstrated the accumulated combat experience that only years of brutal warfare could provide. Officers and NCOs made split-second decisions about when to attack, when to withdraw, when to call for fire support from artillery and assault guns. These tactical decisions, multiplied across dozens of engagements across a broad front, created a tempo of operations that Soviet forces struggled to match despite their numerical advantages. The battle raged across the landscape for more than a week, as German forces, including the Totenkopf Division, gradually encircled Soviet forces and pushed back the Soviet salient. The Totenkopf Division's Panzer Regiment, though small compared to dedicated panzer divisions, played a crucial role in breakthrough operations, engaging Soviet armor when it appeared, and lending firepower to infantry assaults on heavily fortified positions. Soviet tank crews, many of them conscripted from recently conquered territories, and lacking the training of veteran Red Army formations, sometimes found themselves outmaneuvered by German panzer crews, who possessed superior tactical coordination and gunnery skills. The division's infantry elements, despite their reduced strength, demonstrated remarkable combat effectiveness in assaulting defended villages and positions, using artillery support, machine gun fire, and coordinated small unit tactics to overwhelm Soviet defenses. Casualty figures mounted steadily for both sides, yet the Germans maintained their momentum while Soviet forces fell into increasing disorder as their command and control systems struggled to adapt to the rapid changes in the tactical situation. The capture of Kharkov itself, scheduled for mid-March 1943, became a symbol of German recovery and Soviet setback that reverberated throughout the Nazi leadership hierarchy. The city, which had been lost to German forces the previous summer and captured by the Red Army in winter offensives, was retaken through a combination of frontal assault and encirclement operations. The Totenkopf Division played a significant role in the assault on the city, fighting through its suburbs and defensive perimeter, though the final seizure of Kharkov itself involved other German units as well. Soviet forces, realizing the danger of encirclement, began withdrawing eastward, abandoning equipment and leaving behind significant numbers of prisoners and destroyed vehicles. The German armies, particularly the panzer forces that had led the breakthrough, had executed what appeared to be a masterpiece of operational maneuver, defeating a numerically superior enemy through superior tactics, coordination, and aggressive leadership. Yet the triumph at Kharkov, though real in its tactical dimensions, concealed troubling realities that would soon become apparent to German commanders and to the Nazi regime itself. The Soviet forces, while pushed back and disorganized, had not been destroyed or captured in the massive numbers that German commanders had hoped for. The Red Army, despite its setbacks, retained enormous reserves of manpower and equipment that could be brought to bear on the front. German losses in tanks, assault guns, and other irreplaceable equipment, while less than Soviet losses, could not be easily replaced, given Germany's stretched industrial capacity. The Totenkopf Division, like other German combat units, had suffered significant casualties in the advance, and fighting around Kharkov, losses that further depleted the pool of experienced soldiers upon which the division depended. Soviet commanders, chagrined by the reversal but undeterred, were already planning new offensives and reorganizing their forces for the resumption of their westward advance. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Kharkov saw the Totenkopf Division consolidate its positions and attempt to restore its combat effectiveness through integration of replacements and maintenance of equipment. The division had conducted a fighting retreat before the counteroffensive, demonstrating tactical skill and unit cohesion under pressure, then pivoted to offensive operations that restored German initiative in the sector. This sequence of events, though ultimately unsuccessful in achieving any permanent German advantage, illustrated the Totenkopf's evolution into a competent mechanized formation capable of complex maneuvers under difficult circumstances. Officers and men who had served in the concentration camp guard service had been transformed through brutal combat experience, into professional soldiers who understood the requirements of modern warfare. The transition was incomplete, and the division remained smaller than ideal. Yet the combat power it demonstrated around Kharkov was undeniable, and impressed even skeptical Wehrmacht commanders who had long harbored doubts about SS military capabilities. The Battle of Kharkov, however, represented the last significant German tactical victory on the Eastern Front. After the spring of 1943, German forces would find themselves on an increasingly defensive footing, forced to yield territory, reacting to Soviet initiatives rather than imposing their own strategic vision. The Totenkopf Division would soon be thrown into the massive Battle of Kursk, where German and Soviet armored forces would clash in the largest tank engagement in human history. The lessons learned at Kharkov, the demonstrations of tactical competence and combined arms coordination, would be tested against an enemy that had absorbed the lessons of earlier defeats and emerged stronger and more skilled than before. The temporary reversal of Soviet momentum at Kharkov would be erased within weeks, as the Red Army launched new offensives from multiple points along the front. Yet for a brief moment in March 1943, the Totenkopf Division had proven itself capable of standing firm against overwhelming odds, of executing maneuvers that turned defeat into tactical victory, and of maintaining the fierce pride that had defined the unit since its origins, as concentration camp guards transformed into soldiers. The psychological impact of the Kharkov victory extended beyond the front lines into German high command and Nazi leadership circles. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, visiting the Southern Front, observed German combat operations and expressed qualified optimism about German tactical capabilities, despite the overall strategic situation. Adolf Hitler, receiving reports of German victories and Soviet setbacks, allowed himself to believe that the initiative might yet be recovered on the Eastern Front. The Totenkopf Division found itself regarded with greater respect by Wehrmacht commanders, who had previously viewed SS military formations with suspicion or disdain. The division's role in the Kharkov victory provided ammunition for SS leadership, arguing that ideologically motivated SS soldiers, properly trained and equipped, could serve as the vanguard of German military power. These perceptions and interpretations of the battle's significance would influence strategic decisions made in the subsequent months, decisions that would ultimately lead to the catastrophic Battle of Kursk and accelerate the final collapse of German military power. By the end of March 1943, the Totenkopf Division held positions west of Kharkov, having advanced roughly 120 kilometers from its starting positions, and defeated Soviet forces that had appeared, only weeks before, to be unstoppable. The men of the division, though exhausted and depleted, took pride in their accomplishment and in their division's reputation as a fighting force that could survive the harshest conditions and emerge victorious. Yet the knowledge that larger Soviet forces were massing for renewed offensives tempered the celebration. Supply lines stretched longer and thinner as German forces advanced further east. The spring thaw turned the landscape into vast expanses of mud that impeded movement and resupply. German commanders, understanding that the window for decisive action on the Eastern Front was closing, began planning for Operation Citadel, the assault on the Kursk salient that would soon become the largest tank battle in history. The Totenkopf Division would be assigned a crucial role in this coming offensive, though few in the division suspected that Kursk would mark the beginning of an irreversible decline in German military fortunes and in the division's own capacity to sustain itself as a fighting formation. In the spring of 1943, the German High Command contemplated a gamble that would consume the remaining reserves of the Wehrmacht and determine the final trajectory of the war on the Eastern Front. The Totenkopf Division, now under the command of Max Seaman, following Theodor Eicker's death 2 months prior, prepared for what military planners called Operation Citadel, a massive pincer offensive aimed at the Kursk salient, a bulge in the front line stretching roughly 120 kilometers across the steppe. The objective seemed straightforward: encircle and destroy Soviet forces concentrated in the sector. But Soviet intelligence had penetrated the planning, and by July, the Red Army had transformed the region into a fortress of defensive positions, anti-tank guns, and massed armor reserves. The Germans would launch their offensive not against an unprepared enemy, but against one of the most heavily fortified positions in military history. The Totenkopf Division, reduced in strength and exhausted from the winter campaign, moved into position alongside other SS panzer formations, unaware that they were marching toward a military catastrophe that would shatter the myth of German invincibility. The division arrived at the Kursk sector with approximately 12,000 men, fewer than half its authorized strength, and with a tank force that had been carefully assembled from salvaged vehicles and factory production. The newer Panther and Tiger tanks represented technological advances, but they were insufficient in number and hampered by mechanical unreliability and fuel shortages that made adequate training impossible. The Soviet defenders had constructed multiple defensive lines, some reaching 5 kilometers in depth, each reinforced with thousands of anti-tank guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Soviet intelligence continued to provide updates on German movements, and the Red Army commanders had positioned reserves strategically to counterattack once the German assault began. The political pressure on the German command was immense. Hitler had delayed the operation repeatedly, hoping for more tanks and new weapons to arrive, but the window for summer campaigning was closing. By early July, the order came down. The Totenkopf Division, assigned to the southern pincer of the offensive, would advance northward toward the town of Ponyri as part of a broader assault aimed at linking up with German forces attacking from the north. On July 5, 1943, the Totenkopf Division moved forward in the pre-dawn darkness, their vehicles and men moving toward the Soviet defensive lines in a deployment pattern that suggested the men still believed in eventual victory, though the veterans among them carried a weight of intuition that whispered otherwise. The opening artillery barrage, though substantial, could not suppress the depth of Soviet defenses, and as the division's tanks and infantry pushed across the initial terrain, they encountered the first of many anti-tank gun positions that the Red Army had sighted with meticulous care. The Soviet defenders, having studied the German tactics from 2 years of warfare, had learned to concentrate their fire and to preserve their armor, engaging the attackers with coordinated barrages that inflicted steady casualties. The Totenkopf Division pressed forward despite the mounting losses, their soldiers advancing across the steppe in a landscape that offered no natural cover, exposed to Soviet machine gun fire and artillery that seemed to come from every direction. By the first day's end, the division had advanced perhaps 10 kilometers, but at a cost that exceeded optimistic estimates. Casualty reports filtered back to division headquarters that documented the killing efficiency of Soviet defensive tactics, a grim indication that the offensive had failed to achieve surprise and momentum. The subsequent days of the Battle of Kursk unfolded as a grinding, attritional struggle in which the Totenkopf Division was gradually consumed by the sheer weight of Soviet firepower and the unwillingness of their commanders to accept the reality that the operation had already failed. The division's tank crews fought with genuine bravery and tactical competence, using the superior optics and firepower of their Panthers and Tigers to eliminate Soviet armor and anti-tank positions. But the numerical superiority of the Soviet defenders meant that each German victory was merely a temporary respite before fresh Soviet units appeared to replace destroyed units. The terrain, crossed by numerous ravines and anti-tank ditches, favored the defender, and the Totenkopf Division's infantry struggled across open ground under fire, suffering casualties that drained their combat effectiveness with each passing day. Max Simon sent reports to higher command that became progressively more urgent and pessimistic as it became clear that the division was being ground down in a battle of attrition that Germany could not win. The weather deteriorated, turning the steppe into a world of mud and chaos, where the mechanical advantage of German vehicles became irrelevant against the sheer mass of Soviet opposition. By the second week of July, the Totenkopf Division had suffered more than 20% casualties, without achieving the objectives that would justify those losses. The political decision to terminate Operation Citadel came from Hitler on July 12th, driven partly by the news of the Allied invasion of Sicily the day before, and partly by the inescapable reality that the offensive had failed to penetrate Soviet defenses or achieve decisive results. The German High Command, recognizing that the momentum had shifted permanently against them, ordered the withdrawal of SS panzer formations from the Kursk offensive, redirecting them to meet the threat of Soviet counteroffensives that were already gaining momentum across the Eastern Front. For the Totenkopf Division, the withdrawal represented not a respite, but the beginning of a new ordeal, as Soviet forces, now convinced of German weakness, pressed forward in pursuit of the retreating Germans. The divisions that had launched the Kursk offensive with such confidence in German tactical superiority now fell back across the same terrain they had advanced across, pursued by Soviet cavalry, armor, and mechanized formations that showed no mercy to stragglers or damaged vehicles abandoned by their crews. The Totenkopf Division fought a series of delaying actions, attempting to maintain unit cohesion and prevent their complete encirclement. But the coordinated Soviet advance meant that German forces were constantly fighting on multiple fronts and dealing with flanking threats. As the summer of 1943 advanced into autumn, the Totenkopf Division found itself inexorably drawn into a defensive struggle that would consume the remainder of the war without ever offering the prospect of victory or even stable defensive lines. The Soviet offensives that followed Kursk were launched with the confidence of an army that had proven itself capable of defeating the Wehrmacht in sustained combat, and they pressed the Totenkopf Division back toward the Dnieper River, one of the major natural obstacles in Eastern Europe. The division's strength continued to decline as casualties mounted and replacements failed to arrive in sufficient numbers to restore combat effectiveness. The Soviet tactics had evolved to exploit German weaknesses, massing forces at selected breakthrough points, using armor to break through initial defenses, and employing mobile reserves to encircle and destroy isolated German units. The Totenkopf Division, despite the individual bravery of its soldiers and the competence of many of its junior officers, was no longer capable of conducting the kind of coordinated defensive operations that might have stemmed the Soviet advance. The losses at Kursk had been irreplaceable, as the pool of experienced tank crews and infantry leaders had been exhausted in the battles of 1941 and 1942. And replacements trained in the shroud of imminent defeat could not match the tactical flexibility of veterans. The retreat to the Dnieper River in the autumn of 1943 marked a psychological as well as a physical transformation in the character of the Totenkopf Division. The men who had advanced into Russia in 1941 with a sense of ideological purpose were now engaged in a desperate struggle for survival against an enemy that was not only stronger, but also increasingly confident in their ability to defeat Germany. The division's panzer strength was never fully restored after Kursk, as German tank production could not match Soviet output, and the strategic decision to defend everywhere meant that resources were scattered across vast fronts without achieving local superiority at any point. Officers and men alike began to recognize that the war was being lost. Though the ideology that had sustained the SS throughout the campaign remained intact, driving men forward not because victory seemed possible, but because surrender and defeat appeared to offer only catastrophe. The Totenkopf Division crossed the Dnieper River in November 1943, taking up defensive positions in the southern Ukraine, and by this point, the unit had been reduced to approximately 6,000 combat troops, a fraction of its authorized strength. The winter of 1943 to 1944 brought relative stability to the front lines, but no respite to the Totenkopf Division, which remained locked in static warfare against the Soviet forces massing on the opposite bank of the Dnieper. The division attempted to hold its sector of the river against repeated Soviet attempts to establish bridgeheads, and the fighting was characterized by the grim, exhausting nature of riverine defense, in which small unit tactics and the competence of individual soldiers became the decisive factor. The Soviet forces, methodical and relentless, continued to probe German defenses, seeking weaknesses to exploit, and the Totenkopf Division's men found themselves caught in a war of attrition that offered no possibility of victory and only the prospect of slow erosion of their strength. Replacements arrived sporadically from Germany, many of them young men with minimal training, and the integration of these replacements into a unit that had been hardened by years of combat was often difficult and contributed to tactical failures. The ideological indoctrination that had once been a source of cohesion now seemed increasingly hollow to men who spent their days in muddy trenches, enduring cold and hunger while Soviet shells fell around them. By the spring of 1944, more than 2 years after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Totenkopf Division had suffered cumulative losses that exceeded its original authorized strength by a factor of 3, meaning that most of the men who had invaded Russia in 1941 were dead, wounded, or missing. The division received orders in the late spring that would remove it from the Eastern Front and redeploy it to the West, where the Allied invasion of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 had opened a new front and created an entirely different tactical situation. The Totenkopf Division, never fully restored to combat effectiveness from the Kursk offensive and subsequent battles, was withdrawn from Russia to be reconstituted as a panzer division, equipped with updated tanks and trained replacements, and deployed against the British and Canadian forces that had invaded France. The men of the division were simultaneously relieved to leave the Eastern Front and apprehensive about facing new enemies in unfamiliar terrain. The division's retreat from Russia concluded a chapter of unrelenting combat that had transformed them from the concentration camp guards of peacetime into one of the most feared and combat-experienced units in the Wehrmacht. But it also marked the permanent end of any prospect that Germany might achieve victory through military superiority or sheer will. The legacy of the Battle of Kursk in relation to the Totenkopf Division was the revelation that German military superiority was no longer achievable against a Soviet military that had learned to conduct operations at scale with increasing sophistication and technological capability. The offensive had demonstrated that the Wehrmacht's doctrine of breakthrough, encirclement, and annihilation could no longer be reliably executed against an enemy who anticipated German movements and responded with massed firepower rather than tactical retreats. The Totenkopf Division, which had entered the war as an elite formation with advantages in training and equipment, emerged from Kursk as a depleted unit, struggling to maintain the coherence of its command structure and the morale of its remaining soldiers. The losses sustained at Kursk, combined with those suffered in the immediately preceding battles, had removed the Totenkopf Division from the category of elite formations and placed it among the standard Wehrmacht and SS units, struggling to maintain the front against a materially and numerically superior enemy. The ideological fervor that had characterized the division in its early campaigns had been replaced by a grim determination to survive, though many soldiers continued to maintain the psychological equilibrium necessary to function as soldiers through attachment to their unit, loyalty to their comrades, and resignation to circumstances beyond their control. The months between Kursk and the division's deployment to Normandy represented a period of reconstitution and retraining, but the fundamental limitations imposed by German industrial capacity and manpower availability meant that the Totenkopf Division would never return to the strength it had possessed in 1941. The Eastern Front continued to consume German military resources, and the need to defend against Soviet advances in multiple sectors meant that the division could not be given the time, equipment, and personnel necessary for a complete restoration of combat capability. The soldiers who had survived Kursk and the subsequent battles of 1943 and 1944 carried with them the knowledge that they had fought against forces they could not defeat, experienced leadership that had proven unable to achieve the objectives promised them, and an ideology that had guided them into a war that was increasingly understood to be unwinnable. When the Totenkopf Division departed Russia in the spring of 1944, they were leaving behind the graves of countless comrades, the wreckage of a campaign that had cost millions of lives, and any remaining conviction that the Third Reich would emerge victorious from the conflict consuming Europe. The division's future lay in the West, where new enemies awaited and where the process of attrition would continue under different conditions and in a different landscape, but with the same inexorable logic that had driven them down through Russia and across the vast expanses of Soviet territory. The autumn of 1943 brought not victory, but exhaustion. The Totenkopf Division, bloodied by Kursk and driven backward by Soviet counteroffensives, faced a choice that was no choice at all. They could not hold the line. The Soviet armies, now possessed of seemingly inexhaustible reserves and growing tactical sophistication, pushed German forces westward with relentless pressure. For the men of the Totenkopf, this meant withdrawal, not the orderly retreat of a disciplined army, but the grinding, desperate backward movement of units fighting for survival. The roads out of Russia became ribbons of chaos, transport columns moving under threat of Soviet aircraft, wounded men crowded into trucks, equipment abandoned when horses collapsed from hunger. The retreat that had begun at Kursk in July now extended into the winter months, a slow hemorrhage of military capability that no reorganization could fully stanch. What had been a division capable of launching offensives had become a formation obsessed with the simple mathematics of withdrawal. How many kilometers today? How many men still present? How many trucks still rolling? The Totenkopf Division's journey westward consumed the final months of 1943 and stretched into early 1944. The unit did not retreat to the Reich itself immediately, but rather paused in occupied Eastern Europe, primarily in the territories of what had been Poland and the Ukrainian lands. These areas, now under military administration and SS control, offered relative security compared to the active front lines. The division's surviving strength was concentrated in the region around Lublin and further north toward Warsaw, areas already stripped of resources by years of occupation. The irony was bitter for the men of the division. Many had served in concentration camps or guard formations within these same territories. Now they found themselves defending the infrastructure of the occupation they had helped build, pulling back before Soviet armies that sought to liberate the same populations they had once terrorized. The division established defensive positions, dug in against the expected Soviet summer offensives, and began the complicated work of reconstituting a military organization that had been shattered by months of combat and climatic exposure. Theodor Eicke had been dead for 8 months by the time the division settled into its winter positions. His successor, Max Seemann, inherited command of a division that bore only a structural resemblance to the force that had invaded Russia 3 years earlier. Seemann was a career SS officer, younger than Eicke, without the founding general's intense personal authority or his direct connection to the concentration camp system. Seemann's task was formidable. He had to restore fighting capability to a unit that had lost nearly 2/3 of its personnel in less than 18 months of combat. He had to navigate the complex political waters between SS command, Wehrmacht headquarters, and the increasingly desperate appeals from Berlin for trained soldiers. He had to maintain cohesion in a division whose survivors had witnessed horrors and inflicted horrors in equal measure, whose morale had been constructed on ideology and momentum rather than on stable foundations. Seemann approached these challenges with methodical professionalism rather than Eicke's volcanic intensity. He understood that the age of rapid German victories had ended. The division would have to learn to survive in a world of attrition and retreat. The reconstitution of the Totenkopf Division during late 1943 and early 1944 represented a fundamental transformation in its character as a military organization. Before, the division had fought primarily as an infantry formation, with motorized and mechanized elements integrated but subordinate. Now, as the division attempted to restore itself to combat effectiveness, the emphasis shifted decisively toward panzer and panzer grenadier strength. This shift reflected not merely a military preference, but a harsh calculation. Infantry divisions required enormous manpower reserves, and those reserves no longer existed. Panzer divisions, by contrast, could accomplish disproportionate effects with smaller total personnel numbers if those personnel were well trained and equipped with modern vehicles and weapons. The Totenkopf began receiving tank deliveries, assault guns, and self-propelled anti-tank weapons. The integration of these vehicles into the division's structure marked a departure from its earlier character. The division was becoming less a product of the SS's concentration camp system and more an elite panzer formation that happened to wear SS uniforms. This evolution was not entirely unwelcome to the High Command, which recognized that the days of purely ideologically motivated infantry units were ending. Recruitment for the reconstituted division drew from multiple sources, each reflecting the deteriorating German military situation. The core strength came from survivors rotating back from hospitals and rear area assignments, men who had recovered from wounds or sickness sufficiently to return to duty. These veterans brought experience, but also trauma and fatalism. Many had witnessed the collapse of German military dominance on the Eastern Front. They had seen Soviet armor in quantities that defied rational expectation. They had experienced winters that seemed to come from another dimension of suffering. The psychological burden of these men was immense, and no amount of ideological refreshment could entirely compensate for the loss of confidence. The division also received transfers from other SS units, men from the administrative and supply branches of the SS, who were now deemed necessary as combat infantry. Some came from the Waffen-SS recruiting stations in occupied territories, foreign volunteers, and conscripts from the Balkans and Eastern Europe. Finally, there were teenagers, German boys, born in the 1920s, conscripted into the SS because regular Wehrmacht drafts were insufficient. These young men brought no combat experience, but possessed the energy and adaptability that the division required. They also brought something else, an absence of the psychological burden that weighed on the older survivors. They had not seen victory. Their entire war had been defeat and retreat. In a strange way, this made them more amenable to the continuation of resistance. Training during this period took place in a landscape fundamentally altered by war. The division conducted exercises in the occupied territories and in the Reich itself, though security concerns limited the amount of movement that could be undertaken. The curriculum focused on combined arms operations, an essential skill for a division increasingly structured around Panzer Grenadier teams, working in coordination with armor and self-propelled weapons. Training emphasized rapid adaptation and flexibility in defense, recognizing that the division would be fighting Soviet offensives rather than conducting German advances. Instructors drove home lessons learned at terrible cost on the Eastern Front: the importance of digging in deeply, the vulnerability of vehicles to Soviet anti-tank teams, the absolute necessity of coordinating infantry and armor rather than committing them separately. The ideological element remained present in training, but by 1944 it had shifted in emphasis. Rather than lectures on racial struggle and the necessity of annihilation, the training increasingly emphasized sacrifice for the fatherland, the duty to stand firm against overwhelming odds, the honor of the SS soldier. This reflected not a change in underlying ideology, but a recognition that survival, not victory, had become the operative goal. The division's reorganization into a primarily panzer formation required equipment that Germany increasingly struggled to produce. Tank production had peaked in 1943 and was now declining as Allied bombing intensified and raw materials became scarce. The Totenkopf received a mixture of machines, some of the powerful Tiger tanks that had been the terror of Soviet armies in 1943, though now Soviet anti-tank weapons had evolved to counter them. More frequently, the division received Panther tanks, vehicles that represented a compromise between armor protection, firepower, and mechanical reliability. The Panther was a formidable machine, far superior to most Soviet tanks in individual combat, but it was not produced in the quantities necessary to replace German losses. The division also equipped itself with the Sturmgeschütz assault gun, a vehicle that combined devastating firepower with lower visibility, making it valuable in defensive operations. These machines were distributed among the division's mechanized companies and platoons, creating a fighting formation that would have been recognizable as a modern panzer division to any observer. Yet beneath the modern equipment lay a fundamental shortage: trained crews. Replacement crews from tank schools had been diluted by the demands of other divisions and by the recruitment of the best trainees into new Panzer Grenadier formations being raised. The Totenkopf had to make do with crews that were capable, but not always brilliant, experienced, but not always confident. Logistics during this period of reconstitution operated under constraints that would have seemed impossible in earlier years of the war. Germany's rail network was under increasing attack from Allied air forces, making the transportation of supplies and replacement equipment unpredictable. Fuel was rationed with increasing severity, limiting the amount of training that could be conducted, and forcing the division to conserve vehicles for combat operations. Food was becoming scarce, not just for the division, but throughout the Reich, leading to a reduction in rations that affected soldier morale and physical health. The division's quartermaster services worked constantly to maintain supply lines to the division's scattered locations, but the margins had grown razor-thin. A significant portion of the division was still deployed in forward positions facing the Soviet armies, while the remainder was distributed across occupied territories and Germany itself. This dispersal complicated logistics further, requiring separate supply lines and creating the constant danger that forward units would be cut off. The division's leadership understood that any future major campaign would quickly exhaust their supplies unless resupply could be guaranteed. This knowledge influenced strategic calculations about where the division could be committed and for how long it could sustain operations. The morale world of the division during this reconstitution period was complex and contradictory. The survivors, those who had endured Russia and survived to return, often carried a stoic fatalism. They had seen what German weapons and courage could achieve, and they had also seen it was not enough. Yet paradoxically, many of these veterans possessed a fierce determination to fight on, motivated by a combination of survival instinct, unit loyalty, and ideological commitment that had been hardened rather than softened by their experiences. The ideological dimension of SS service had always been central to the Totenkopf, and the challenge of late 1943 and early 1944 was to reaffirm that ideology in a context where victory had become impossible. The division's leadership, from Simon downward, conducted constant ideological indoctrination sessions, emphasizing that the war represented a struggle for the survival of the German people and the Germanic race against overwhelming enemies. The new recruits, the young conscripts, and the foreign volunteers absorbed this ideology with varying degrees of conviction. Some believed it entirely, finding in Nazi racial ideology a comprehensible explanation for catastrophe. Others accepted it as the price of service, as the ideology required by their uniforms. Still others maintained private doubts while conforming outwardly to the requirements of military discipline. By the spring of 1944, the Totenkopf Division presented to observers a formation that was simultaneously more modern and more fragile than at any previous point in its existence. The division had been re-equipped with some of Germany's finest vehicles and weapons. It had been reorganized into a structure that reflected current understanding of effective panzer warfare. It had been replenished with personnel sufficient to staff this structure at approximately 90% of authorized strength. Yet every man involved in the division's operations understood that this reconstitution was temporary, that the equipment could not be replaced when lost, that the personnel could not be sustained if casualties approached the rates experienced in Russia. The division remained in occupied Eastern Europe through the spring months, conducting defensive preparations and field exercises, watching the Soviet armies across the lines, and waiting for the inevitable spring offensives that would test the reconstituted formation. The division's command structure believed itself ready for these tests. The division's soldiers, both the hardened veterans and the new recruits, operated under a paradox. They were now, in material terms, better equipped than at any previous point in their history, yet they faced enemies whose superiority in manpower and resources was overwhelming and growing. The division had been reconstituted, but it could not be restored. The trajectory of the war was fixed, and no amount of reorganization or new equipment could alter its destination. The only question remaining was how long the Totenkopf Division could stand before that overwhelming superiority, and whether the men who composed it would survive the process of being ground down by history. In the spring of 1944, the Totenkopf Division existed in a state of exhausted reconstruction. The unit had been withdrawn from the Eastern Front months earlier, its ranks decimated by the grinding campaigns of 1943. What remained was a shroud of the force that had emerged from concentration camp guard battalions a decade before. The survivors were veterans of the worst fighting on the continent, men whose faces bore the weight of winters in Russia, of tank battles at Kursk, of endless retreat across burning steppes. They had been moved to occupied France to rest, to absorb replacements, and to train with new panzer tanks that promised to restore some measure of combat strength. But rest was a luxury that Germany could no longer afford. The Wehrmacht command knew that the Allies would strike across the English Channel, and when they did, the Totenkopf would be needed to stop them. No one in the unit believed they could win anymore. What they believed was that they would fight, because fighting was all they had ever been trained to do. The invasion came on the 6th of June 1944. The beaches erupted in fire and chaos, but the Totenkopf Division was not there to defend them. Instead, the unit lay in the interior of Normandy, and in the hours after the first reports of landings reached German command, confusion reigned. Where exactly were the Allies? How many were there? Which beaches would be the real invasion? The Totenkopf, now reorganized as a panzer division with approximately 18,000 men and about 180 tanks, received orders to move northward toward the landing zones. But movement in the face of Allied air superiority had become a nightmare of a different sort. The skies above Normandy belonged to the British and Americans. Every road, every forest edge, every crossroads risked attack from fighter bombers that swooped down with machine guns blazing. The division began its journey toward the coast in daylight, a decision that proved costly. Vehicles were destroyed, soldiers scattered, and the coherent movement of a major military formation became nearly impossible. What should have taken hours stretched into days of stop-start movement, hiding, waiting for darkness, moving again under constant threat from above. By the 7th of June, the Totenkopf Division had received orders to attack toward the British and Canadian beachhead between Ouistreham and Courcelles-sur-Mer. This was not the grand counteroffensive that German generals had envisioned in their war rooms. This was something far more desperate, an attempt to contain the landing before it became uncontrollable. The division's panzer elements began their assault against British and Canadian positions, and for the first time since leaving the Eastern Front, the Totenkopf found itself in direct combat with Western forces. The British and Canadians fought differently from the Soviets. They had superior artillery support, air superiority, and the ability to bring overwhelming firepower to any contested position. The bocage of Normandy, the ancient hedgerow terrain that characterized the region, was nothing like the open steppes of Russia. Every field was a potential trap. Every hedge could conceal anti-tank guns. Every village became a fortress. The Totenkopf's tactics, honed in the vast spaces of Eastern Europe, had to be adapted to this new kind of warfare, where distances could be measured in meters rather than kilometers, and firepower density was infinitely greater. The division's panzer regiments achieved some initial successes. Their tanks were superior in quality to most of the British armor they faced, and German gunnery, developed through years of brutal experience on the Eastern Front, remained excellent. But superiority in individual tank quality could not overcome the arithmetic of modern warfare. The Allies had more of everything. They had more tanks arriving every day. They had more guns. They had more aircraft. They had soldiers who were, on average, better supplied, better fed, and less exhausted than the German troops opposing them. For the Totenkopf Division, this realization came not in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small moments of attrition. A panzer company would attack a hedgerow and lose 2 tanks to anti-tank guns hidden in the bushes. An infantry platoon would assault a British defensive position and return with half its men. A supply convoy would be caught in the open and scattered by fighter bombers. Each loss was irreplaceable. Each man killed or wounded represented a diminishment of the division's strength that could never be fully restored. There were no replacement tanks arriving from German factories at the rate the Totenkopf needed them. There were no trains full of fresh soldiers ready to absorb the division's casualties. Germany in June 1944 was losing a war of attrition, and the Totenkopf Division would pay the price for that grim reality. The fighting in and around Caen became particularly vicious. The British, under General Montgomery, had intended to capture Caen on the first day of the invasion. They had not done so. Instead, the ancient city became a focal point of grinding combat that would last weeks. The Totenkopf Division was drawn into the struggle for Caen and remained there through the summer, defending and counterattacking in the rubble-strewn streets. The intensity of the fighting was extraordinary. British and Canadian forces brought artillery fire of a density that many Totenkopf veterans had not experienced even on the Eastern Front. The combination of naval gunfire, army artillery, and air support created a cauldron of fire that made traditional defensive positions suicidal. The division had to learn new ways to fight, digging into the ruins of houses, using rubble for protection, fragmenting into small combat teams, rather than the larger unit formations that had worked on the open steppes. The soldiers adapted, as soldiers do, but the cost mounted. Officers who had survived Russia were killed or wounded. Experienced non-commissioned officers were cut down by machine gun fire or artillery. The division's strength began to hemorrhage away week by week, and there was nothing to replace it. By mid-July, the Totenkopf Division had suffered casualties numbering more than 3,000 men and dozens of tanks destroyed or damaged. The division's strength report showed that combat power was declining rapidly. But the fighting was far from over. The Allies needed to break out of Normandy and begin the campaign to liberate France and drive toward Germany itself. This breakthrough would require the defeat of German forces holding the Bocage, and the Totenkopf Division was one of the principal German formations still capable of sustained resistance. The division received orders to hold its positions and to counterattack when opportunities arose. What had once seemed like a strategy now seemed like desperation, dressed in the language of military doctrine. The division could hold ground, but only at the cost of continued bleeding. It could counterattack, but with diminishing forces and mounting exhaustion. The men of the Totenkopf were caught between the demands of their commanders, who needed them to stand and fight, and the realities of a situation where standing and fighting meant death or capture, with no possibility of strategic success. The hedgerow warfare of Normandy was in some ways even more exhausting than the massive tank battles of the Eastern Front. There was no grand operational sweep, no potential for a brilliant maneuver to encircle the enemy. Instead, there was the grinding reality of small unit combat, of assaults on fortified villages, of defensive positions that had to be held and then abandoned when flanked. The division's soldiers encountered an enemy that was disciplined, well supplied, and increasingly confident. The Canadians proved to be particularly fierce fighters, and several Canadian units developed a specific hatred for the Totenkopf, based on documented atrocities and summary executions of Canadian prisoners by SS personnel. This hatred translated into combat of extraordinary savagery. The Totenkopf troops found themselves facing enemies who were determined not merely to defeat them, but to avenge previous crimes. Some of the worst fighting of the Normandy campaign occurred between Totenkopf units and Canadian forces, and the casualty rates for both sides climbed accordingly. The psychological dimension of this warfare was as significant as the physical destruction. The Totenkopf soldiers were fighting against an enemy that not only had superior numbers and firepower, but also had what they perceived as personal motives for vengeance. As July turned into August, the strategic situation for the Totenkopf and the entire German armies in Normandy became increasingly desperate. The Allies were building strength in the bridgehead faster than Germans could reinforce their positions. American forces had broken through in the west, towards Saint-Lô, and were beginning to move toward Britain.